think everyone's in the room. Could we come to order? I'll welcome the witnesses. And the committee is actually in the home stretch. We call that in the horse racing industry. In the home stretch in terms of pre-budget consultations. Two last panels today. So welcome to the witnesses. Pursuant to Standing Order 83-1, we're continuing our pre-budget consultations for the 2017 budget, and as I think all the witnesses know, we're trying to emphasize what proposals would improve economic growth within Canada. And so I would welcome all the witnesses here today. We are attempting, not always successful, but attempting to hold people to 5 minutes in terms of their initial presentations. We do have the presentations that have been forwarded in, even the late ones, on our mobile devices, and you'll see members looking at those devices from time to time. Before we start with witnesses, I understand Mr. Albas has a notice of motion he wants to present, which shouldn't take too much time. Go ahead.
And I appreciate that, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to make a notice of motion specifically that the Standing Committee on Finance undertake a study of the de minimis and give recommendations to the Minister of Finance at what the appropriate level should be.
Okay, so we have the notice of motion. The motion will be debated at printed, delivered to members, and we'll debate that at another time. So with that, then, starting with the Canadian Construction Association, Michael Atkinson, President. Welcome, Michael. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and honourable members. On behalf of the some 20,000 member firms that we represent in the Canadian Construction Association, it is indeed a pleasure to be here with you today. Since I do only have 5 minutes and I don't want to be second to last and go over time, I'm going to get right into it. We have 5 recommendations for you to consider. Number 1 is with respect to labour mobility. And my comments here are specific to EI-eligible unemployed. A mobile workforce is critical to the country's future, particularly in our construction sector. We need to encourage the unemployed to travel to where the jobs are and not limit their job searches to just their local market. But as we all know, money is tight when you are unemployed, which is why most unemployed Canadians limit their search to their local labour market, which leads me to recommendation number 1. To overcome this challenge, the Canadian Construction Association recommends current EI policy be amended to permit the unemployed to access an advance of up to $2,000 from their approved EI benefits to help offset their job search costs outside their local market. This could be done through the existing EI claim process without the federal government incurring any significant new administrative costs. Moreover, it would encourage the unemployed to broaden their employment search outside their local market without incurring significant expense at a time when they can least afford it. Should they find work as a result of this expanded job search, repayment terms could be negotiated between Services Canada and the EI recipient. Number 2, labour force development and training. Another way we can help create additional employment opportunities for groups currently detached from the labour market is to incentivize employers to invest in their training. The Canada Job Grant was one important initiative, but its focus is on short-term skills only, making it too limited for most employers to consider when training someone with specific employment challenges. Furthermore, no employer is going to move a bookkeeper into a controller position just because they took a week-long course on accounting. So it's unrealistic to think that short-term upskilling will lead to additional hiring. Recommendation number 2, the program needs to be expanded to encourage more longer-term skills development. 3, apprenticeship training. Another solution is to create greater financial incentives for employers to participate in workforce development. Our members are particularly interested in apprentices, and we believe the government has it right with respect to the apprenticeship job creation tax credit. This program helps many medium-sized employers take on apprentices by subsidizing their wages for the first and second year of their program. Unfortunately, however, the credit is limited to a maximum of $2,000, which for most small and micro businesses, which is 99% of the companies active in the construction industry, is not a substantive enough incentive to encourage them to hire apprentices. So recommendation number 3, we would like to see the credit expanded. Right now it only applies to apprentices in their first and second years of apprenticeship. To try and incentivize also apprenticeship completion, we'd like to see it expanded to year 3 and 4. We'd like to see the $2,000 limit moved to $5,000. And we'd like to see the current credit only applies to Red Seal apprentices or apprentices in Red Seal trades. We'd like to see it apply to all provincially recognized apprenticeable trades. Number 4, infrastructure. We believe investments in infrastructure and the strategic use of tax policy can best contribute to business growth in all regions and sectors of the country. And infrastructure is an economic enabler. The better our infrastructure is, the more efficient we as Canadians can export our goods and services to international markets. And with all that effort Canada has put into trade diversification through free trade agreements, we must not limit our potential growth opportunities due to infrastructure limitations. Unfortunately, that is the situation we face today. Much of our trade-enabling infrastructure is operating at near capacity with limited ability to accommodate any significant additional growth. And while I'll leave it to my colleague at the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers to quantify this problem in his sector, let me just say this. If we are going to continue to permit the extraction of natural resources in Canada, does it make sense to deny ourselves the best possible price for those resources because of infrastructure limitations? We need to prioritize the development of trade-enabling infrastructure so as to ensure we continue to receive the best possible global price for Canadian natural resources. And that's recommendation number 4. To that end, we recommend the federal government establish a public-private advisory committee to help prioritize and direct investment decisions related to critical trade-enabling infrastructure. As part of this effort, the federal government should ensure that these identified assets receive priority funding from either an expanded national infrastructure component under the current New Building Canada plan or through the proposed Federal Infrastructure Bank. Number 5, and the last one, capital cost allowance. The allowable capital cost allowance or capital depreciation on mobile diesel-powered equipment and machinery in the construction industry does not allow us to write it off over the useful life of the equipment. In fact, we are in a disadvantage when it comes to the tax treatment of that equipment in the United States. Also, the newer forms of equipment have better emission controls, so the newer engines are much more environmentally friendly in that respect, and so we feel that in trying to encourage a turnover in that equipment to go to the more advanced machinery is also good for the environment. So I'm sure my 5 minutes are up, or just about up, and so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atkinson. Canadian Supply Chain Safety Coalition, Albert Chambers, Executive Director. Welcome, Albert.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting us. It's not our first submission, but it was our first time asking to come before you. The coalition was formed 16 years ago. Our membership is composed of 32 national, provincial, and regional associations that represent businesses at every link in the supply chain, from input suppliers through primary producers, transportation, processing, manufacturing, distribution, and importing, to final marketers at export, retail, and food service. Our vision is that Canada's agriculture, aquatic, and food industry will have a world-class reputation for producing and selling safe food. And in brief, our mission is to facilitate the development and implementation of a national coordinated approach to food safety. For this presentation, our members have 2 objectives. First, to ask the government to set out a 5-year funding plan for its own food safety initiatives and for incentives to the private sector to invest in theirs. And second, to ask the government to develop a comprehensive national food safety strategy in collaboration with the provincial and territorial governments, with industry, and with other stakeholders. But before I go into detail about these requests, I'd like to set out some of the broad context. Canada is in the midst of modernizing its food safety legislative and regulatory system so as to catch up to our major trading partners and to assure comparability and equivalence in the future. The first step of this initiative was completed in 2012 with the passage of the Safe Food for Canadians Act. It replaces 4 acts and 13 sets of regulations with 1 act and 1 regulation. It dramatically expands CFIA's active surveillance to thousands of currently unregistered farms, manufacturers, importers, and exporters, and it replaces a prescriptive regulatory approach with one that's focused on outcomes, prevention, and shared responsibility. We expect to see the first official version of the new regulation within a few months, and for those regulations to come into force later this year. Within the next year. This will complete the second step. The third step is implementing this new food safety regime, which will require significant investments by both government and industry over the next 3 to 5 years. To complete modernization, officials in industry have identified a fourth step of further changes. These include adding segments of the supply chain excluded from the current proposals, amending Section 41A of the Food and Drug Act to bring it into compliance with the Food and Drugs Act in the U.S., and consolidating the Safe Food for Canadians Act and the food components of the Food and Drugs Act within one statute. Since our foundation, the Coalition has been a strong supporter of food safety modernization. However, we remain disappointed that over the past 16 years, no federal government has articulated a clear national food safety strategy. The Coalition firmly believes that Canadians, no matter where they reside or purchase their food, are entitled to the same level of assurances about its safety. In July, the provincial and territorial ministers of agriculture pledged cooperation in implementing the new regulations. As part of the next agricultural framework, the time appears to be ripe to develop a comprehensive national food safety strategy. As noted earlier, implementation will require significant new investments. The next budget presents a timely opportunity to make these investments possible. Our submission provides considerable detail, but I'll just cite a few examples. For food businesses, they're going to have to develop, implement, and update new preventive control plans. They're going to have to train their employees on the new requirements. They're going to have to establish traceability systems to facilitate recall, and there's going to be, in some cases, new capital investment required. For CFIA, they have to retrain their inspectors, recruit new staff with new competencies, ensure the regulations are uniformly applied, establish a monitoring program to assess its effectiveness, and establish capacity to assist thousands of newly regulated businesses, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. Health Canada has requirements to maintain its strong scientific capacity. The Public Health Agency also has requirements that we've set out in the document.
We'll have to get you to
I'm just cut it finished, Mr. Chair. To meet these challenges, we believe the next budget should provide for the development of a national food safety strategy and set out a 5-year plan for food safety funding. This would involve providing financial incentives for food businesses and providing increased funding for federal agencies and departments to carry out their new responsibilities. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. With the government of Nunavut, Ms. Tungaluk.
Yes.
And I may have pronounced your name wrong.
Hello, my name is Teresi Tungilik. I'm from Rankin Inlet, and I'm an artist. Addressing the artist resale right for Canadian artists would be a huge step for Canada to take. This would touch on all artists of all walks of life and people who are well or with disabilities to gain financially. 93 countries have laws that support the artist resale rights, which in turn the dollars are fairly given back to the real artists after a resale has occurred. This in turn not only benefits the Canadian galleries, museums, and auction houses and the artists, but our country as a whole, as countries that abide by the artist resale right will indeed be able to pay from their countries to our Canadian artists when their art has been resold. Making the artist resale right a law in Canada can only be a win-win situation for both the artists and our country. My father, Mark Tungilik, carved nearly every day. This was his income. He was on he This was his way of providing for the 7 of us along with his hunting. My father's carvings have been and are in many Canadian and European art galleries. Since his passing in 1986, I have become his beneficiary for his artwork. Yet for the last 30 years, I have not received a nickel, though there are records of his carvings being resold to galleries, museums, auction houses, both in Canada and abroad. This is our reality as Canadian artists, like we are forgotten. If the Canadian government takes action to make it law to have the artist resale rights, this would greatly increase the art business world. I would like to take Klinoyak Asibak with her enchanted owl. When she made this print in Cape Dorset, Nunavut, she received an embarrassingly measly $24 for the print. After her passing, this same print fetched over $34,000 to an auction house, meaning that she could internationally. This artist resale right can grow our economy due to the fact that many Inuit art are sold and resold through galleries, museums, and auction houses in our country and abroad. This would be an expansion of our national economy, as most of the artists do buy mostly in their communities, meaning that the money stays in our country after it has come in from other countries. Art among Inuit is a big business. It brings in more than $30 million annually just into Nunavut. Many Northerners cannot find jobs due to the lack of job availabilities. When you look at urban, rural, and remote communities, art brings in cash and supplements low income. The artist's resale rights will have a positive financial impact as 10% of Canada's export is Inuit art. Imagine the other Canadian artists that sell within the 93 countries, how much more it would bring into Canada. The remote communities would really benefit from the artist resale rights, as we in Nunavut have the highest cost of living. For many, jobs are hard to find, and living on social assistance is not their choice, but need to have it because as families need to feed their children. If they are artists and the artist resale right would increase their household income, and this would bring in less dependency on the government and help bring in about self-reliance. When you look at foreign visitors or dignitaries, one is usually given an art as a gift. Because art is thriving in the northern communities of Canada and they are beautifully created. This shows that the importance of identity that Canada has. Since the creation of Nunavut on April 1st, 1999, Inuit have become sought after by more countries like France, England, Germany, and Japan remain the strong buyers of Inuit art. Though I am Canadian, I'm a Northerner. I feel assured that I can speak for artists from my region. I know with Canada legislating the artist resale rates, it can only help and not hinder our northern economics. I know every dollar counts, and I can only imagine how happy an artist will be upon receiving their ever first royalty check. With this kind of expectation, this can lead to more innovative creations of the arts and how important the art will feel, how important the artist will feel that their art is worthy enough to be resold and resold again. But the amazing thing would be that he or she would be paid again and again from those pieces. The artist resale rights really isn't going to cost the federal government anything, yet it will put cash into the hands of its artists. Now is the right time for our great nation to make that move. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just For our records, when we do the report, we have you both down as government of Nunavut and as an individual in your own right. So I suspect your presentation is as an individual.
Yes, I do work for the government of Nunavut. I'm the advisor for arts and traditional economy for the with the Department of Economic Development, but I'm also an artist, and I'm also on council in Rankin Inlet and on the status of Women Council. So I have.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
so we get it right in our detail as we record it in the report.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Independent.
That's great, not a problem.
Okay.
With the Canadian artists representation, Madam
Title, thank you.
Title.
On behalf of the Canadian Artists Representation, Front des Artistes Canadiennes, along with our 7 provincial affiliates and our partner in Quebec, RAV, I want to thank everybody for having us here today. And I want to begin my presentation with 3 quotations. The first is from the APTN article that announced the death of Annie Pututuk, the Inuit artist who drowned in the Ottawa River several kilometers from here. Pututuk used to compose her ink and crayon drawings that once raised her to international acclaim in the contemporary art world before she was swallowed by the darkness in the alleys and the riverbanks of the capital city that have also obscured her last moments on earth. Pututuk was selling drawings on the streets, floor blocks away from the National Art Gallery, where her work hangs on the walls. She was 46. This next quote is Daphne Ojig, an Indigenous artist from the Ottawa Nation. Quote, "It was not until later on in life that I had achieved a semblance of success, and at 92 years of age, I am surviving on a small pension and returns from dwindling investments." It's worth noting that Daphne Ojig's art now is rapidly resold all over the world, and in 2012, the 12 pieces that were sold at auction would have given her over $7,000 of income had the artist resale right existed. The third quote is from Peter Taptuna, the Minister of Economic Development for the Government of Nunavut. He's now the Premier. Thank you. Inuit artists have brought their vision of the world to an international audience and built an economic sector that creates jobs and contributes tens of millions of dollars every year to Nunavut's economy. Today, we add our voice in support of the artist's resale right and encourage Canada to address this critical piece of legislation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is critically incumbent upon the members of this government, settler artists, and all peoples in Canada and across the world who enjoy Indigenous arts to once and for all erase the false distinctions between Indigenous artworks, their lives, and their lands. This point was made in spades again and again by the Inuk artist Billy Gauthier in this past week, whose hunger strike brought about nation-to-nation negotiations for his land in Labrador. And he consistently spoke of the intersectionality between the health of his body, his land, and his art. So what is ARR, the artist resale right? It's very simple. It's a 5% royalty of all public sales of art, not private, and it gets kicked back to the artists themselves in recognition of the fact that the value of their work has increased the value of the art throughout their careers. The artist resale right works to protect and empower all artists, but particularly it raises the most vulnerable of them out of poverty, and mostly Indigenous artists. In Australia, 2 years after implementing the ARR, statistics were taken and they found that over 65% of the artists receiving royalties were Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, and that they had received 38% of all royalties collected. That's hugely disproportionate to the demographics in Australia. In Canada, Indigenous art is not an insignificant industry on First Nations reserves, Inuit communities, and Métis settlements. Just ask the woman sitting next to me how many people in Rankin Inlet make their living off of art. Ask the less than 2,500 members of the Haida Nation, whose art is ubiquitous in Canada, around the world, and gracing the bicep of our Prime Minister. Then ask yourselves to critically assess the industry that has arisen that brings so much Indigenous arts to the professional art market, where the work is highly valuable. These middlemen, who call themselves art dealers, go on to reserves in the north, buy up tremendous amounts of art at wholesale prices, and resell the work immediately on international art markets where they get double, triple, quadruple the amount of money that they originally paid for it. None of this money goes back to the artists themselves. No artist currently has the right to protect themselves from middlemen who prey on remoteness or poverty in order to make a quick buck. There is only one way to ensure that artists profit equitably from the value of their labor, and that is by implementing the artist's resale right. So, why have I brought the ARR to the Finance Committee and not Heritage Committee today? 3 reasons. 1, the ARR has tax implications. The sale of art is considered capital gains and is therefore only 50% taxable. But the ARR takes 5% of this and turns it into artist incomes, which is 100% taxable. Ladies and gentlemen, I will be the only person here who is begging you not to give us money, but rather for us to give you money. This will add money into the Treasury and cost the government nothing to do. Second reason, the ARR is proven to reduce poverty. It is an income generator for artists, who are some of the poorest laborers in Canada. The average visual artist pulls in $18,000 a year, while the value of their labor creates profits for governments and the communities around them all the time.
Dara, if I can get you to sum up in about a minute.
1 more second. I just want to make the point that these are not struggling or insignificant artists that are earning the $18,000. These are our best artists, our brightest minds. And, you know, what other industry can boast such success for the people around them, while ensuring that next to no profits go to the laborers themselves? And thirdly, and most importantly, the lack of ARR is actually a trade barrier. 93 other nations in the world have the artist resale right, and some of them since the 1920s. This isn't a new idea. It isn't a risky scheme. It's a why haven't we done this already, right? And that's why the UN has actually recommended that every nation in the world adopt the ARRs before 2012. So we're late, but we're not too late. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, Mr. Ferguson, Vice President, Policy and Performance. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and honourable members. I'm pleased to present a few comments and highlights of our submission on the federal budget. I want to let you know we've been working with, kind of unusual for us, we've been working with Fort McKay First Nation on some of the ideas and concepts that we've bolted into our overall submission. And I know the Chief had hoped to be here today co-presenting with me, but instead is attending, along with many other Canadians, the memorial service for the Honourable Jim Prentice tomorrow. So he does express his I've read through many of the other presentations made to you over the past few weeks, and I'm struck by the wealth of ideas provided, mostly in the spirit of growing the Canadian economy for the benefit of all Canadians. I'm also here today to tell you that our sector has participated and supports much of the work that is being done by the Advisory Council on Economic Growth. We look at that as a very important piece of work that is, provides a longer-term view of economic growth pathways for government to consider. But equally important, it's a longer-term approach, such as defined in there, helps provide context for shorter-term actions for economic growth. First, I want to emphasize that what we already know. Much of Canada's historical, present-day, and future economy includes our ability to take advantage of one of our foundational strengths, our ability to develop and trade our natural resources. That requires an ability to better attract foreign direct investment into Canada. As noted by the Advisory Council, Canada has fallen behind comparable jurisdictions in terms of FDI growth over the past several years, and we certainly welcome the government focus through that Advisory Council recommendation on that activity. But there are also opportunities for government to maximize benefits from the utilization of capital available within Canada. And I know we've talked about this when I've previously come before this committee. You know, our sector has been known as the country's one of the largest receptors of capital investment for some years now, and will continue to be. We believe that there are some opportunities for our government to bring real change to our tax system, for example, that will optimize the utilization of capital in Canada to increase the benefits for all Canadians. I wanted to highlight a couple of examples, and we've provided and worked through a lot more detail. One specific opportunity we see is to review and implement changes to the large corporation tax rules under CRA. Refocus this with a mindset towards some more transparency, we believe, and efficiency will give tremendous opportunity for redeployment of underutilized capital. We believe, not just from our sector, from across sectors, that we can set a target of anywhere from $10 billion to $30 billion or more in underutilized capital to be better deployed across Canada and across sectors. A second opportunity we've identified is reviewing and looking at the fiscal treatment under CRA of capital costs in our sector. Certainly the CRA rules for capital cost treatment have not kept up with the technology and innovation changes that have dramatically changed the nature of our business, not just in Canada, but around the world, but specifically in North America. We think now is the time to relook at that and find opportunities to be more efficient in how capital is treated under CRA. And third opportunity is, and you've heard this many times in previous testimony from what I've reviewed, the Scientific Research and Experimental Tax Credit program. It's great opportunities in that program. I think you've heard from many others, opportunities such as broadening the program to provide tax credits for capital expenditures on clean tech and climate change mitigation. And there are several other opportunities in there that I know you've heard. But stepping back for a moment, more broadly, we'd offer a few other recommendations as well. Certainly want to see the continued support of the development of infrastructure that diversifies the markets that Canada's natural resources can access. And as you know, I'm not allowed to speak very often without mentioning pipelines at least once. So I will mention that, but also the opportunity for marine infrastructure in Canada, and certainly the natural gas export infrastructure, which is very important for our sector. Second opportunity we see is around the innovation agenda, and we saw a great start in that in the last budget. We're looking for more definition and more specificity going forward. But certainly we believe our sector has been developing some good strength, foundational strength in development of what we would call an innovation supercluster framework that would help lead government's innovation agenda. And we're thinking beyond the inclusion beyond our sector, opportunities in related sectors that are here today as well. We believe government should support the opportunity that we would present as a global scale strength in this innovation supercluster framework that is pretty unique and take advantage of. We also believe government should continue, as we saw in the last budget, continue efforts to further wrap up. Okay. No problem. Okay. I struggle at my house as well, so it's not much different.
Just getting to the punchline because you were getting to be over time.
Thank you very much. And I only had a few more points, so I'll be really quick, and then we'll move on. I don't want to take up any more time. I was just referring to, Canada's contribution to the innovation agenda, which we're really looking forward to in the next budget, in more detail. I was just wanted to highlight quickly one of the recommendations we will be making is to see continued efforts that we see taking place around to further Indigenous peoples' full participation in Canada's social, cultural, and economic future. And I was really interested in the presentation that was just made before me in that vein. We certainly see opportunities to review Canada's participation in the value chain in our sector. If there's ways for manufacturing to be incentivized to see some growth in what we see as opportunities, future opportunities in the petrochemical and chemical industries, and I know you've seen some presentations from those sectors already in this process. And I just quickly want to mention, lots of continued efforts in optimizing our workforce opportunities, which we heard already. I won't go into those in detail. And certainly continued efforts to develop those international trade relationships and agreements that are so important for our present and future. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for the opportunity, and we'll move to the next one. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the interruption. Canadian Credit Union Association, Ms. Durden and Mr. Martin.
Thank you very much. Merci à tous, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux membres du comité.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to committee members.
Credit unions, as you know, are member-owned, full-service banking institutions that serve over 5.6 million Canadians. We contribute $6.5 billion to our country's GDP and help create over 58,000 jobs. We support small and medium-sized business with 11.5% market share, and that market share is close to 50% in some markets out west. In a recent CFIB study, credit unions are far ahead of the banks when it comes to serving small and medium-sized business in Canada. And this year as well, we ranked first for the 12th year in a row in customer service, well ahead of the banks. We do this from what is largely a traditional banking model, taking deposits, making loans. However, the current environment is challenging for us with low interest rates, federal tax changes, increased regulatory burden, and new mortgage lending rules that are all making it more difficult to serve our markets, mostly middle-class Canadians. My remarks today will focus on two key priorities: allowing for a regulatory pause to assess the full impact of recent mortgage change rules before any new risk-sharing measures are considered, and implementation of a risk-based approach to the Common Reporting Standard. Our first and most pressing recommendation is that the government implement a regulatory pause to assess the impact of recent mortgage rules and mortgage rule changes, before proceeding with new risk-based measures. As you know, the government recently announced two changes to mortgage insurance parameters. The first change implements a stress test for high-ratio insured mortgages. These borrowers have less than a 20% down payment. The second change will implement, as of November 30th, new qualifying requirements to obtain low ratio mortgage insurance. This is when a borrower has 20% or more as a down payment. In our view, and the view of others, that these recent measures will dampen mortgage markets across Canada and will make it more difficult for those aspiring to the middle-class goal of home ownership. To elaborate, in the October Monetary Policy Report, the Bank of Canada recognized the impact of these measures will have and projected a slowdown in the housing market through 2016 and 2017. In fact, the bank projects that in 2017, rather than being a net contributor to GDP growth, the housing sector will become a drag on the Canadian economy. The bank also projects a significant dampening of resale activity across Canada. According to Genworth Financial, a little over 1/3 of insured mortgages, predominantly for first-time homebuyers, will have difficulty qualifying for mortgage insurance. Genworth has also estimated that approximately 50 to 55% of their total portfolio of new insurance written would no longer be eligible for mortgage insurance under the new low-ratio mortgage insurance requirements. Preliminary credit union analysis suggests that in some instances up to half of low-ratio mortgages would no longer qualify for low-ratio insurance. This could have a significant impact on funding opportunities for credit unions, our ability to raise capital, and would increase prices for members and our customers. On top of these measures, the government recently released a consultation paper on mortgage insurance risk sharing just last week. Two of the proposed models would require lenders to accept more losses if loans default. A third model would establish premiums that lenders would pay that would be based on loan losses in a specific period. In our view, implementation of any of these proposed models during a period when other mortgage measures have taken hold would be unwise. Mortgage activity would face a further slowdown, credit costs would rise, resale activities would decline, and mortgage credit would be harder to come by. As the market tightens, aspiring homeowners across Canada would find it more difficult to obtain a first mortgage or get home financing in economically challenged regions. Especially concerning because many of these regions are not experiencing the housing sector upswings in the Toronto and Vancouver markets. Credit unions are particularly concerned about the impact these measures would have on the 380 small communities where we are the sole risk and mortar financial institution. Once again, I'd like to emphasize the need for a regulatory pause before the government moves towards implementation of a new risk-sharing framework. Our second recommendation is to incorporate a risk-based approach to the Common Reporting Standard. As you know, in Bill C-29, the government included an amendment that will bring Common Reporting Standard into force in Canada. This standard is intended to help curb cross-border tax evasion by facilitating the automatic exchange of financial account information between tax jurisdictions, except, of course, the U.S. Bill C-29 does not propose a risk-based approach to compliance. Instead, the standard is being implemented as a one-size-fits-all basis, require all finance institutions, even those at a low risk for being used of this type of tax evasion, to begin reporting on all accounts held by non-residents. This, despite the fact that the Seaway survey found that the median number of non-U.S. non-residents served by Canada credit unions is 3. Just 3. This means that every credit union will have to dedicate additional resources for account screening, review, analysis, monitoring, reporting, and record keeping. Banking system changes will need to be made and additional staff training undertaken, all to report to CRA annually on a handful of foreign-held accounts. In our view, regulatory compliance based on risk assessments makes more sense. To this end, CCUA urges the federal government to apply a risk-based approach where institutions qualify under an annually applied test that would be exempt from CRA application. This is similar to the approach that we employed under FATCA, the current bilateral tax agreement with the U.S., and it makes sense to apply it for Common Reporting Standard. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Martha. Canadian Steel Producers Association, Mr. Gal Limberti.
Right. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, honorable members of the committee, and thank you on behalf of our association for the opportunity to present to you today as part of your study on Budget 2017. The Canadian Steel Producers Association is the national voice of Canada's $14 billion primary steel production industry. Our producers are integral to the automotive, energy, construction, and other demanding industrial supply chains here in Canada. Our mandate is to work with governments and industry partners to advance public policies that will enable a globally competitive business environment for our members and our supply chain stakeholders. As committee members are undoubtedly aware, it's a remarkably difficult time in the global steel industry, and Canada is not immune to or sheltered from truly international challenges in the sector. Global excess production capacity in steel has now risen to in excess of 700 million metric tons annually, with the People's Republic of China, through a variety of state supports, by itself now maintaining more than 425 million metric tons of the total global surplus. For context, that's almost 30 times the size of the total Canadian market. Despite declining domestic demand in China. Widespread institutional ownership of and support for China's steel sector is the single largest force disrupting established trade patterns and degrading the pricing of steel products globally today. The steel industry has, as a result, on a worldwide scale, seen a significant increase in market-distorting dumping and circumvention practices, both from China directly and from a variety of other global producers whose home markets have in many cases suffered as the result of unfair Chinese competition. Once home markets are inundated with subsidized product from China, other global producers are left with no choice but to export aggressively, dumping yet more product into global markets and further degrading global prices. So while our association would commend the Government of Canada for its work pressing forward on the development of multinational solutions to the problem of global overcapacity in the sector, which has recently included statements from the North American Leaders Summit, G7 and G20 on the importance of reducing capacity through the elimination of state supports and other subsidies. And while we will encourage Canada's continued senior-level participation at the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity, which was established as an outcome of the latest G20, we would also caution that international solutions on overcapacity will not be quick in coming. And for context, as I make this statement, I would note that from 2003 to 2015, China has issued 9 separate...
I'll have to get you to slow down a little bit.
Sorry.
Okay, not a problem. Go ahead.
Right. It's a delicate act trying to get it in and then do the 5 minutes.
They got to be able to translate it, though, for it to have meaning.
Absolutely. 9 separate policy statements addressing steel expansion in China, while at the same time their production capacity has increased in total by roughly 1 billion metric tons annually. So with this in mind, we believe the Government of Canada should move very quickly to strengthen Canada's domestic trade remedy system through legislative amendments, which we believe should be included in Budget 2017. In the more than 2 decades since the last substantive reform of Canada's trade remedy system, the companies and countries engaging in unfair trade have proactively and through sophisticated means adjusted their practices to skirt Canadian regulations and unfairly gain access to our markets through the development of sophisticated software platforms, direct electronic solicitations, offers to circumvent duties in place, falsification of documents, price engineering, and other manipulations to understate the actual costs associated with production are all commonplace and constantly evolving far beyond what is currently contemplated in Canadian legislation. So as part of Budget 17, our association recommends that the Government of Canada amend CIMA to immediately address issues where calculation of dumping margins does not accurately reflect the real amount of dumping in the Canadian market, address the need for enhanced and more transparent processes to make available to the Government of Canada in instances of circumvention and scope rulings, and to provide needed clarification as regards the type and amount of evidence domestic industry is required to put forward to get cases initiated. As I close, I would remind this committee that unfairly traded goods pose a clear and present threat to the livelihoods of the over 22,000 middle-class Canadians employed directly in steel production and the additional 100,000 Canadians whose employment is indirectly supported by our sector. Steel production in Canada involves significant advanced manufacturing processes, and Canada's steel workers are well educated, highly skilled, and trained throughout their careers. As such, we would suggest it is in the government's defined interest to ensure that steelworkers in Canada do not have their employment security compromised by market distortions created by the policy decisions of foreign governments or offshore corporations. Moreover, given environmental realities and standards associated with foreign steel production, including the transport of raw materials, requirement for secondary inputs like electricity and transport of product to end markets, there is a significant environmental penalty associated with the use of foreign dumped and subsidized steel in Canada. Domestic production is reliant on efficient local supply chains, operates on a modern and largely emission-free power supply, and benefits from short distance to end markets. The same could not be said for imported products, which impose a significant GHG penalty and undermine Canada's ability to properly understand and regulate the full life cycle environmental impact associated with infrastructure development, energy exploitation, and manufacturing in Canada. With this in mind, I urge this committee to recommend a quick and fulsome reform to Canada's trade remedy system that will ensure Canada's steel producers, steel workers, and steel works are effectively protected from well-documented and corrosive effects associated with global overcapacity and unfair steel in trade. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Then turning to Unifor, Mr. Brennan, economist with research. Thank you.
Yep, good afternoon. On behalf of Unifor's 310,000 members, I'd like to thank the committee for allowing us to share our views with you here today. You can find the details of our submission in the document of August 5th. The industries where Unifor's members work are essential to the success of the Canadian economy and serve as the nation's leading centres of advanced technology and innovation. They are also Canada's top exporters and a source of increasingly scarce good jobs. Unifor's members have the highest interest in the success of their industries and have a long track record of partnering with employers and with governments to enhance productivity and innovation. Unifor believes in an active role, a leadership role for government to develop strong and sophisticated policies that leverage strategic investments to secure long-term economic development. The federal government's Automotive Innovation Fund has served as an important tool for securing investments that anchor the wider auto industry in Canada. However, the structure of the AIF is increasingly out of step with investment attraction programs in other major North American auto-producing jurisdictions. Additionally, in the current low-interest period, the value of a non-interest loan with front-end loaded tax obligations is significantly diminished. Reflecting the growing consensus in the industry, Unifor recommends that the AIF be amended to become a non-taxable granting program with flexible rules and procedures and proportionally comparable funding parameters as observed by other leading auto jurisdictions. Canada should develop a one-stop system to win and attract new investment in Canadian assembly and parts plants. Bombardier's C-Series program has been hailed as a game-changer for the commercial aviation industry. Once facing questions about its long-term viability, the program had seen significant orders this year, and this summer saw the first C-Series planes come into use with Swiss International Airlines. The aerospace industry has significant and positive impact on Canada's economy. Good jobs, superior skills development and productivity, technological innovation, and a positive trade balance are just a few reasons why governments all over the world invest heavily in their aerospace industries. Unifor recommends that the federal government invest $1 billion for a direct equity stake in Bombardier's C-Series program in support of good jobs, productivity, and innovation. An equity stake in the company would solidify the long-term viability of this Canadian success story. And given prevailing trends, the government could probably expect a handsome return on its investment through capital appreciation and distributions. Planned new infrastructure spending is welcome news, including the $20 billion new transit spending over the next decade. Public transit systems will be a key driver of delivering quality of life improvements to Canadians, including tackling climate change. Unifor believes these new investments in infrastructure, and especially transit, should also be tied to broader economic development objectives. Buy Canadian and local content rules affixed to new investments are proven job creation and skills development tools. They encourage the development of industrial competencies that foster global competitiveness for Canadian products. Unifor recommends provisions for Made in Canada public transit equipment procurement and local hiring requirements, especially among underrepresented workers, including women in the skilled trades, visible minorities, young workers, and Indigenous workers. For Canada to continue to be a leader in advanced technology and innovation, we need to ensure that all Canadians have the ability to contribute to Canada's economic growth. Lack of affordable childcare continues to be a significant barrier to working families, and especially working women. Government must create an affordable childcare program so that all Canadians can contribute to our long-term economic development. Unifor accepts that we must now address climate change, and that as a nation we need to transition to a low-carbon economy. We support the concept of a just transition, which is the principle endorsed by the International Labour Organization, when industrial transformation imposes a burden of change on workers and their livelihoods. Unifor calls on the federal government to implement the principle of just transition, including periodic review of labour market impacts at provincial and community levels to assess affected groups and to assess which strategies are needed to ensure that the costs associated with transition to a low-carbon economy aren't unduly borne by working families. Investment of the EI surplus into training programs so that workers can capitalize on the green jobs being created through public investment, and expanding access to EI. I see my time is up, so I'll thank you with that, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, that'll be, and we are, on account of the delay, we really are tight for questions, so we'll go with we'll go with 5 questions, 5 minutes each, starting with Mr. Greywall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming here today. I just wanted to start off with the Canadian artist representation. Resale rights. Can you give an example really quickly on how, like an artist, so they produce it, it's bought, and you're saying that on the next sale, correct me if I'm wrong, they should be given the money. Why is that?
It's a royalty. So, for example, I'm a playwright by vocation, and every single time a piece of my writing is reproduced after the initial production of the play, I receive royalties. So do most artists in Canada, because it's our intellectual property. This is the function in order for visual artists to share in royalties. Yeah.
You said that 89 countries had...
93.
Sorry?
93.
93 countries had similar legislation. Is the United States one of them?
The United States isn't one of them. The state of California, I believe, has it. Okay. The entire EU, Australia, New Zealand.
Is there an economic study on how much it will benefit artists?
Not in Canada, because the public sale of art is not public information. However, the countries that recently passed it, including the UK and Australia, have metrics about how much it has benefited artists since that data has been collected through the artist resale right, and it's significant. And in your opinion, will it really help our Indigenous brothers and sisters who are artists? Absolutely, and you don't have to ask me for it. And the evidence-based research is there that proves that from other countries. You mentioned the 93 other nations that have it. Many of these are developing nations where their artisanal and Indigenous art is highly valuable, and that's why they've chosen to pass that law, to protect their Indigenous artists. Thank you very much for your testimony, and I learned something today, so that's usually... I'm so happy. It's always a good thing. Of course, I spend all my time with Mr. Chair. He's a very knowledgeable man. The Canadian Construction Association, even with the global downturn in commodity prices and the new mortgage rules that have just been implemented by our government, do you see a slowdown in the construction across the country? In certain geographical areas and in certain sectors, there is a slowdown. There's no question about that, particularly on resource-based industries, industrial sector. But there is also an uptick, and we're very optimistic in the future, particularly with the amount of renewal that has to be done in Canada's public infrastructure. We're just reaching the end of its useful life of 40, 50 years since it's been built. And it's coming home to roost now that we need to make that reinvestment. So you would agree with our infrastructure plan and to ensure that it will stimulate economic growth? Absolutely.
quality of infrastructure is directly related to how well a country does economically.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Atkinson. My next question is for the petroleum producers. You know, Ron Leapert's not here today, so I'll ask about pipelines. He's a member from Alberta who always talks about pipelines. In your assessment, what would the impact of approving another pipeline have on your association's members?
Well, I can offer approving a pipeline is only part of the equation. It's getting it constructed and flowing a product to a market that's willing to buy it is the other part of the trick that we're pretty focused on as well. But certainly, you know, we look at, you know, I can give you a couple of quick numbers that may help you understand. There's been some work done by different institutions in Canada. Each stalled pipeline project would open up access to world markets that each time you stall one costs Canada between 11 and $25 billion in foregone economic benefits on an annual basis.
In terms of jobs?
Well, you know, it's hard to, if we haven't, I don't think there's any numbers specifically around that, but if you include just the jobs related to approving a pipeline, there's probably quite a few, because including a lot of lawyers apparently.
Yeah, but, there's no shortage of lawyers and lawyers.
But during the construction phase, it's a pretty heavy economic activity.
I don't think we're too concerned of lawyers. I'm a lawyer myself. They find a way to eat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, thank you. My last question is for the Canadian Steel Producers Association. China. I have a small business in my riding who ordered a container of steel from China and then got hammered with an anti-dumping duty, and now you know, they're basically threatening bankruptcy because the duty is like 200%. What has China done to your industry? Like, is it that crippling, the fact that we have those anti-dumping duties at 200%, and is that the level that we need them in order for internally to sustain the Canadian marketplace?
Yeah, without knowing sort of the nature of the steel that's in question, China's overcapacity has devastated the global steel industry. It is a truly global problem. I mean, it's come up at the G20. It's something that all sort of nations are addressing. The duties are set through a long process of investigation by the CBSA and the CITT, where they determine injury to the Canadian vendor of a similar product. So the CBSA, and then confirmed by the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, would have established that 200% is the degree to which China was subsidizing the product and then dumping it illegally in Canada. So yeah, it is, if that's the amount that the duty is in place, then yeah, there is a really firm basis in free enterprise economics as to how that was determined.
Sorry, we're Mr. Deltel.
Thank you so much, Chair. Mesdames, Messieurs, soyez...
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Canada's Parliament.
To Mr. Ferguson of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Be welcome to the House of Commons, sir. I just want to be clear. You said that every year that we wait to have a new pipeline, and if you talk the example of Energy East, which is, I do concern with that because it's in Quebec, it will go in Quebec. It costs, how much money do we lost every year?
Well, there's different estimates, but anywhere from total economic opportunity foregone is anywhere from 11 to 25 billion per year.
Okay, it was the right number I took. It's amazing.
Pardon me?
It's amazing.
Yeah, there's estimates that are higher, but I think, and it changes over time depending on the differential price, international markets versus North American markets, but it is significant.
I can assure you that on this side of the room or in the House, we do strongly support. And yes, I'm a Quebecer, and I'm a proud, strong supporter of the Energy East project. And as soon as possible, better it will be for Canadian economy and especially for Quebec economy. So I would like to ask you some question about the fact that, as you know, the Prime Minister announced the imposition of the so-called liberal carbon tax, which will apply pretty soon. So what will be the impact for your business, this new liberal tax?
And certainly we have looked at that hard. As you know, we have a number of jurisdictions in which we operate, primarily Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan, that has a variety of different instruments where we value carbon and do activities related to that. There's been, for example, in Alberta, quite a significant amount of work on GHG reduction mitigation policies. There has been a carbon tax imposed there. There's also other costs related to that, regulatory as well, based on a value of those emissions. British Columbia, as you know, has a carbon tax, has one in place for quite a few years now. Saskatchewan, for their part, have done a lot of work on investing in technologies related to carbon capture and storage. So I think the first thing I would tell you is that our sector is not ill-prepared for dealing with and working in this kind of environment. I think as we proceed and we go beyond at the upper ends of the announced price that we see, there would be a need to look hard at what that means in terms of our competitive environment for investment and trade with other nations, primarily the United States, which does not have anything near the stringency that we have in Canada on this issue.
And when we all recognize that in Canada we produce 1.6% of les émissions de gaz à effet de serre, the word in French.
We produce greenhouse gases, 1/6 of them.
Or China or America, but those two great countries, those great economies, don't have that kind of carbon tax. So our industry will have a huge price to pay if we want to be competitive in the on the international level.
And certainly our approach to this is very much from the opportunity space. We know that putting a price on carbon drives the kind of innovation that we are seeing in our sector. That is really a lot of what's driven us forward. The energy efficiencies that we've created in our sector has been because we put a price on carbon ourselves. Again, we still need to be very mindful of what effects in the long term, midterm it has on the Canadian economy as a whole. But we are at that challenge.
How much time do I have, Chair?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, I will not have the time to ask another question, but I just want to make the point that for us, we are very concerned about the fact that the new carbon tax will have a huge impact on many economy and many business in our country, and especially for those who work in the petroleum sector. And by the way, speaking of petroleum sector, I'm sure you know that, but in a few weeks from now, you will celebrate the 70th anniversary of the discovery of the huge Leduc #1 plant, which launched this fantastic journey of a petroleum in Alberta. We appreciate so much what you have done, and we just hope that in this time when we have such difficulty in your business, that you get back to the spirit of the pioneer who built this fantastic industry for Alberta, but first and foremost for Canada.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you'll see more opportunities come forward like that will change the game for our economy.
Thank you both. Mr. Caron.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you to all witnesses. Merci à tous les témoins. Just quickly on this, Mr. Ferguson, I'm just looking at really what the position of your association is. Your CEO actually commented last summer that the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers mentions that the oil industry is agnostic about carbon pricing, which means basically that you're not in favor, but you're not opposed. You'll just deal with it, basically.
Yeah, I guess that would be a good interpretation. Our membership at our association, I will tell you, has as diverse a view on carbon pricing and how it's to be applied as the Canadian public has, more than likely. But the one thing that is common across it is that we understand that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. We have been addressing it, and through all the diversity of opinions around the methods, we will continue to address it.
Merci. C'est simplement pour souligner que votre association, comme l'Association canadienne...
Just to underscore that your association, like the Canadian Natural Gas Association, are not holding out against the carbon price, and some associations, such as the Mining Association of Canada, actually support it. That gives you an overview of the different opinions across industry. Ms. Tidal and Ms. Tinjunik. Let me put this question to both of you, given that you are both speaking to the same issue of artists' copyright. Why is it important to include artists' resale rights in this budget, 2017? Why not for the following year or in a couple of years, giving time to plan this?
Waiting for a long time. When you look at other artists that are either in performing or in literature, they get royalties. Musicians will get royalties, but the visual artists do not get a cent back when anything of their stuff has been resold. And this is what we would like happening in Canada as well as the other 93 countries that abide by it.
And I would just add to that every single year that goes by, thousands and thousands of dollars that could end up into the pockets of some of the poorest laborers in Canada, all of your constituents, are being missed. So these aren't people who have incomes to spare, and the money is significant that they are losing as time goes on. We don't have the largest lobby voice in the world. Artists have a hard time to acquire the capacity that other lobby voices have, but this is something that we need, and we've been asking for it for over a decade from CARFAC.
Et je vous dirais en fait que la page la plus...
I might share that the most impressive page of your brief is the last one, where you have Daphne Odjick speaking and Mary Pratt as well. At the very end, you quote Mary Pratt. She has painted back in the 60s, and her paintings were sold for $40 back then, and now she's living in poverty, even if her works are now being sold for around $20,000 each. So she gets absolutely nothing of that from the $20,000, correct? And it's a speculative sale, and trade speculators are benefiting from this, and she's just living in poverty. Now, you said that this was for works being sold on the public market. Why not on the private market?
Tracking of such things, and also because we believe it would be more onerous to try and track it for private sales. Public sales are easily tracked. The galleries, dealers, and auction houses are the only people who really sell publicly. They just have to remit 5% of the sales, which is shared between the buyer and the owner, to the Copyright Collective, which already exists in Canada. The Copyright Collective is responsible for remitting that payment to the artist. The artist is responsible for registering themselves with the Copyright Collective. It's actually an incredibly easy system to track and to administer.
Merci beaucoup. Question rapide de Madame.
Thank you very much. To Ms. Gurdon. For Bill C-29, the OECD standards being applied, you've contacted the government. You're saying, what's the response so far? This seems to be a legitimate concern of yours.
We have pointed this out to the government. I think the government's view is that they have signed an agreement at the level of the OECD, and they're abiding by that agreement. I think there is the opportunity to look at it, how it's implemented in Canada, and to look at a risk-based approach in the implementation. We don't have any take issue with the fact that we're taking on this, that we've signed this agreement with the OECD. It's more the implementation that we'd like to see a more risk-based approach.
Just if I could follow up on that, Martha, you've said earlier that these mortgage insurance requirements will affect the credit union's ability to raise capital, and that puts you. And I do know that the credit unions are in a lot of rural areas versus the banks, but that puts you in a much more difficult, or the credit union is in a much more difficult position. So my question would be this: why would the impact on credit unions be that much greater than the chart? First of all, what is the impact? Secondly, why would the impact be so much greater on the credit unions than it would be on the bank? On the banks. I think we need to hear that explanation. And how could it affect, which this committee's mandate is to look at how could it affect growth?
So this is new news. It was announced last week, as you know, and we're in the process of modeling some accurate data, which we will share with the committee and with you when we get it done. But suffice it to say that credit unions securitize mortgages as a way to raise capital, and the ability to securitize these mortgages under this approach will be constrained, and therefore our ability to raise capital. Chartered banks have other ways to raise capital. They go to the markets, they raise it through shares, and they go to the public markets. So that's essentially the difference. Do you want to add something?
And on the economic growth side, how could that affect economic growth? I mean, we're trying to find ways to how do we better achieve economic growth in this country? Could that have a negative impact on us doing that?
Just I want to finish up the answer in relation to securitization. Credit unions have been traditionally institutions that take deposits and make loans, and we earn money off of margin on loans. Retained earnings are, of course, important to our growth. In recent years, more credit unions have been getting into securitization as another conduit to fund loan growth. And actually, the CMHC has almost promoted it in a way in previous years by increasing allocations for credit unions to engage in securitization. So now, unlike the banks, we're not able to go to private markets. We're cooperative institutions to raise capital. And they can get access to covered bond markets because they have the volumes to do so. So I just wanted to finish up that. The second question was in relation to economic growth. The Bank of Canada, in its recent monetary policy report, suggested that in terms of the impact of some of the measures that are taking hold, because they haven't all come into force, some will come into force on November 30th, but they're projecting a drag that the housing sector will become a drag on economic growth, I think by down 2%. Let's put it this way, other sectors are going to have to pick up that slack. Frankly, we have to do a deep dive on the data side to determine what's going to happen for our, we're in a lot of rural, remote areas. And I think the other thing you have to keep in mind is that these measures, the logic of them makes sense in the context of the Lower Mainland, possibly, and parts of Toronto and maybe Greater Toronto area. But a lot of the housing markets in the prairies in Western Canada, Maritimes, parts of Quebec, they are actually, they have housing surpluses or, new builds that aren't being absorbed by the market right now. So I think you'll see that it'll make it more difficult to absorb that excess capacity.
Okay, Mr. McKinnon, 5 minutes, and then Mr. Albes after that.
And this is the last segment, just to be clear. So I will give a question at the end of Mr. Sorbera. I did want to ask you, Mr. Ferguson, very, very quickly. You, in fact, just to put a finer point on Mr. Caron's questioning and Mr. Deltez, you have members that, in fact, support the approach of taxing carbon put in place by Ms. Notley.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think pretty common. Quite a few, actually.
And why do you, I don't want you to put words in their mouth, but why do you suspect that is the case?
There's I think a lot of different business drivers. A lot of these companies are in different segments of the sector. They're in different conditions in terms of what their exposure is to debt and equity markets, so they're looking at longer term, shorter term cost implications, where they're at in the innovation technical cycle for their businesses. You've got a ton of factors that are driving the differences of opinion, as you would expect.
Is it also because it's a global industry and this is a global effort and they're looking for certainty from Canada?
Oh, certainly. We have companies that operate in Canada that are owned, that are global entities. We have U.S.-based companies, and certainly we have a lot of Canadian-owned, Canadian-driven companies as well. So you get those opinions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. That's very helpful. Mr. Atkinson, I just want to explore with you. It's fitting you come today and speak about this because we've heard about it in virtually every session, and that is the issue of people without jobs and jobs without people. And you have a specific prescription with respect to apprenticeships and making sure that we have a workforce in your vital sector that is there for generations to come, so to speak. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to expand a little bit on your EI suggestion and understand how the interrelationship of that and labor mobility.
Oh, very quickly, there's been a number of studies done as to the disincentives for mobility and with respect particularly to the unemployed looking for work, done by groups like Build Force Canada, for example. And I know the building trades as well have done some research in this area. And one of the biggest disincentives is the cost, actually, to go outside your own local area to look for work. So we're trying to break down those disincentives to make it more accessible for individuals. In the apprenticeship world, we very much would like to see greater engagement by employers, but the vast majority of our employers are small businesses. In fact, Stats Canada, 60% of them have less than 5 employees. And there's been a lot of studies done internationally that show that incentivizing the employer sometimes is a much more productive way to go. Hence, we'd like to see an expansion of the apprenticeship job creation tax credit.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank my colleague for allotting some time. To the Credit Union Association, looking at these measures that we're introducing, we want to maintain the financial stability of our housing market, and that's a paramount concern to all of us. With these measures, though, there's going to be, I think, at my level, an impact in mortgage availability, credit availability, the competitive landscape, and potentially pricing. But on a bigger picture question, I wanted to ask, the competitive landscape, how does this impact the competitive landscape for credit unions today versus what may happen tomorrow with these proposed regulations?
It will certainly add costs to the mortgage market, which will, of course, get downloaded eventually to customers. I think the credit unions, being very, very small institutions, have less ability to absorb any of the costs, less ability to raise funds on the open markets, and therefore they will be more impacted if we're not able to securitize our mortgage loans. Means that we will not be able to refinance existing mortgages, and that will impact Canadians.
Because the footprint of a lot of credit unions are obviously in rural regions and smaller towns.
So we are actually about 380 communities in Canada where credit unions are the only bricks and mortar banks. And we are very active in rural communities across the country. So of course the impact will be higher in those communities, and those are the communities that I think these rules are not really aimed at trying to redress any inequities.
Thank you, Francisco. Mr. Alves.
Thank you again to all of our witnesses for your testimony, ideas how we can grow the economy. I'd like to start first actually with the credit unions. Just on that point, one of the things that has been discussed here in Ottawa is also serving rural areas with the potential viability of a post office bank. Obviously, if those were established and a Canada Post Bank that would put those rural credit unions at risk as well, would it not?
Yes, it would.
Yeah. So I just wanted to put that out there. In regards to the FATCA provisions, because that is something that is imposed by the government, it's something that this committee will see. It's in the Budget Implementation Act. You have given the suggestion that there is already another regime created for the American FATCA regulations that works well because it acknowledges that not all institutions, particularly the small ones, have a high risk. You're suggesting the government to go with a 2% or less, or 2% stress, or not stress test, provision.
Threshold.
Threshold, pardon me, thank you. So why do you think the government is implementing this measure in such a way that's very top-heavy? Summerland Credit Union, by the way, is one of the smaller credit unions in my riding. They have 10 people. How does that work?
Well, I wouldn't speculate on why it's being posed in from a regulatory perspective rather than a risk-based perspective. I think it's very logical to look at it in terms of applying a regulation based on risk. And if the average number of members are in smaller credit unions is 3 that may have accounts abroad, then I think there isn't really much risk of tax evasion. And we can apply an approach that keeps that in mind.
So there's a separate regime that covers basically the same concern, that there's some tax evasion.
Yes.
Right.
So FATCA applies to the U.S.
Yes.
This new measure applies to OECD countries, so a much larger number of countries.
Yeah, and we did hear in Quebec City that the Desjardins had to do 300-plus submissions, while some of the other banks only had to do 1, just because of the very structure of credit unions and how different they are in their structure. So I appreciate you sharing about a lot of those with us today. I'd like to actually just also go to the Canadian Steel Producers Association. Mr. Gambardi, appreciate your testimony here today. We've had some discussions about steel rebar and some of the perverse incentives that end up, or the results that end up happening because of the system that we have now. I'm not going to dig into that, but I did hear something from one of the national shipbuilding, a representative from one of the national shipbuilding companies, where they said that they'd like to see more involvement of Canadian steel in the production of these great new vessels. Unfortunately, there's very little interest from steel companies to participate because of the large investments that it would take to be able to provide that. Have you heard of any of this before?
Well, I think it sort of depends on the level of, those are highly technical projects. It depends on the level of sort of where that ship is being built, or the level of plate that's required. I know that SR Algoma, for instance, in Sault Ste. Marie, was initially supplying plate to some of the shipbuilding in the Maritimes. I believe that one of our members in Western Canada, Evraz from Regina, is supplying plate to the Western Shipbuilding Initiative. It's sort of the
discussion that the gentleman made was some of the specialized parts are being taken up, but again, the larger orders, right now it seems to be that it's mainly U.S. or even some cases Chinese steel, and German steel. Pardon me. And so to me, that's a concern if there's not interest, because one of the things we've heard at this committee is that when government says, here's 30 years of business, why would we not want your companies, part of your membership, being part of that?
Oh, look, I can tell you that there's certainly interest, and we've had briefings with Public Works and with the shipbuilders responsible for those projects, and with D&D about the specifications. If there is an opportunity even to make an investment in facilities, our producers have demonstrated that they're willing to move to make that investment, so long as it makes economic sense. The reality of steel is, if you have a plant that's already making a very specialized product in the environment that exists today, with transportation costs being as low as they are, perhaps it doesn't make sense to make a significant capital investment from an economic perspective.
Because again, when we're talking about the issue of a drywall tariff, similar to what happened a few years ago with rebar, right now you have residents of Fort Mac who are trying to rebuild their homes that are facing higher costs because of the system that you're suggesting needs to be changed even further to what I would say is going to end up where we have consumers paying more and not necessarily seeing Canadian companies picking up that slack. So it's an area that I'm a little concerned about.
And that's fair, and I certainly wouldn't presume to comment on the drywall, the gypsum board issue, because it's got nothing to do with sort of steel. What I will tell you is this, from a steel perspective, and this goes to rebar, our concern is not with fair trade. Our concern is with product that is dumped and subsidized by foreign governments, which puts Canadians out of work. So, in as much as there is no shortage of supply that's demonstrable on the West Coast, there are ample opportunities to purchase products not from Canadian producers exclusively, but globally from producers who are selling at a fair price. We think that that's fine. Our only concern is where the CBSA and the CITT demonstrate through rigorous investigation that people are cheating the system to get access to product that is putting Canadians out of business.
We will have to cut it there. I know people are in the room are waiting for the second panel. We had a shutdown of some equipment here, so we're a little over time. I do have one question. We like to ensure that all the witnesses have a question. Mr. Chambers, you haven't been asked one. What we've heard from a lot of witnesses, actually, is that agriculture is one of the growth industries of the future, and you are talking about food safety. And you do talk about increasing funding to Canadian Food Inspection Agency. I wonder about efficiencies in that system, and I'll just give you an example. My question is going to be, how can your proposal, how from your proposal can we get to economic growth within the whole food chain? But my point I want to make in Canadian Food Inspection Agency, I'm just not quite happy with them at the moment, I will admit. They moved an operation from a location where they had an agreement with a marketing agency for housing the inspectors. They moved into a city where they won't tell me what they're paying for rent, but I'm told it's probably 5 times higher than it was at the previous location. And the answer they gave me when I said, why would you move to a new location that's going to cost you more, longer distances to go to the farm community, and the response they gave me was, well, that we don't pay the rent, it's Public Works that pays the rent. And I'll tell you, I'm not happy with that answer, because we need to talk about efficiencies across government. So if CFIA is listening, I hope they are. So my question to you is, it's not just a question of funding more for CFA, it's a matter of creating some efficiencies within their system as well. And how do we achieve greater economic growth with what you're proposing here, either in the Canadian context or the North American context?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Regrettably, the Prime Minister didn't appoint me as president of the CFIA last week, so I really can't provide you with a good answer on your initial question about the relocation of a CFIA office. But to get to the broader question, Canada has a really good reputation for producing safe food. And over the past 2 decades, the world has changed. The expectations as to what it is that governments should be doing and that industry, all the way from the farm through to the processing sector and beyond, should be doing to assure consumers of food safety, have changed significantly. So we're trying to catch up now with where the Europeans have gone, where the Americans have gone, where the Australians, the New Zealanders, where our major competitors in the export market already are. We're now trying to catch up in both regulation and in industry activity. We have an industry that has been strong. There are something like just under 7,000 food companies registered with FDA as exporters of food. Now, that's more than we have in Stats Canada's last survey of where the food processors really are in Canada. But when you look at it from another perspective, there are less than 50 of those firms that have 500 or more employees, and only 450 or so that have between 100 and 500 employees, and all the rest are medium or small or micro-sized firms, and they're going to be playing catch-up in order to preserve their access to the retail markets, to the food service markets, and to the global or continental market. There's going to be significant change which industry supports, goes right down to your potato growers in PEI and all the way up through the chain. And we're looking for some investment by the government to assure that we're going to have the inspectorate that's competent and in sufficient numbers to handle these significantly larger number of companies that are going to be involved. And we're looking at some opportunity, especially for small enterprises, you know, the ones with between 1 and 50 employees, to be able to upgrade their systems, put in the new regulatory requirements, make the changes they need. So we're looking for some incentives there. If we don't do those things, then we'll have trouble demonstrating comparability with the Americans or others in the global marketplace in terms of our regulatory system and inspection system, and we'll have trouble meeting the requirements from an industry perspective to meet those markets as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Brennan, I know you never got asked a question either, but I do remember vividly Jerry Dias when he was here at the last hearing we had on pre-budget. I mean, you represent a lot of workers across this country. The debate then was on Bombardier, and he had a very clear answer on why they should be funded in order to to maintain our aerospace industry. Do you have anything you want to add?
Well, just to that, there's been some chatter in the media about Bombardier being bailed out, but strictly speaking, it would be an investment. It would be shuffling assets on the left side of the government's balance sheet away from cash towards shares. So that would be the only thing I'd like to have on record there. There is no request for a bailout. It is an investment that, and if you look at Bombardier's stock price, chances are it would be a very wise one.
Okay, with that, we will call it a day with this panel. We will. I thank all you for your presentations. We also have the original ones on our mobile units, and we'll suspend for 5 minutes for the next panel to get situated. Meeting suspended. As you know, this is the last panel on pre-budget consultations for the next budget, and we've heard from a lot of witnesses across the country and in Ottawa. We, as you know, we're trying to emphasize what needs to be done to achieve better economic growth in Canada, and so if you can tie that into your remarks, it would be great. We do have all the presentations that have been made. They are on mobile units, and so members will be looking at them from time to time. We'd appreciate it if you could hold your remarks as close to 5 minutes as possible to give time for questions. So starting then with the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association, Mr. Eby. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very pleased to be here. Canada's wireless industry is comprised of a diverse range of competitors that all share a common goal: empowering more Canadians to use wireless to do more. Canadian consumer preferences have created our mobile-first world, where smartphones and tablets are the preferred choice to communicate, navigate, inform, shop, bank, work, collaborate, entertain, and be entertained. Businesses rely on wireless to stay connected to their customers, employees, and partners, as well as to increase productivity. Both consumers and enterprises depend on the wireless industry to continue investing and innovating so they can maximize the value of their wireless experience. Investing to deliver and enhance expansive mobile broadband service will inherently contribute to Canada's economy and Canadian prosperity. It will also support many of the objectives identified by the committee as a focus for this consultation, including helping all Canadians in all regions maximize their contributions to the economy and assisting businesses in meeting their expansion, innovation, and prosperity goals. Indeed, few measures could better contribute to all the goals identified in the budget consultation than facilitating wireless network infrastructure investment. Canadians are the fourth highest consumers of wireless data in the world, and Canadian mobile data traffic is projected to increase by 600% over the next 4 years. Meeting this demand presents an opportunity to directly benefit all Canadians. However, the nonstop infrastructure investment required to do so also presents a significant challenge. Total Canadian investment in wireless infrastructure in 2015 was $2.9 billion. The results of this investment are significant. Canada's wireless network infrastructure covers an area bigger than the land masses of France, the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, and Spain combined. Throughout this massive service area, Canadians have access to average smartphone connection speeds that are more than 50% faster on average than in those 5 European countries.
Touch, they're having a little difficulty.
Certainly. And we take advantage of this service. Canadians use about 90% more data on average than users in these countries, and 83% of all mobile traffic in Canada travels over the latest generation 4G networks, compared to an average of only 51% of mobile traffic in these major European economies. Wireless infrastructure also requires significant spectrum investment. More than $12 billion has been invested in spectrum auctions since 2008, and the government currently benefits from more than $1 billion per year in direct revenue from payments for the right to use spectrum. All of these investments create jobs directly related to network expansion and enhancement and the ongoing delivery of advanced wireless services from Canada's service providers. In 2015, Canada's wireless industry supported 139,000 full-time equivalent jobs. Infrastructure investments will continue to be necessary to meet the demand of exploding data use and ensure a consistent level of service for all Canadians. Strategic government policies can facilitate additional investment in wireless network infrastructure to help ensure this demand is met and support innovation and economic development across Canada. To further enable investment in wireless network infrastructure, CWTA submits that Budget 2017 include an accelerated capital cost allowance from current rates to 50% for classes of depreciable assets that relate to telecom network equipment, including broadband networks. The direct impact of this increased telecommunications network infrastructure investment enabled by these proposed changes would be $163 million increase in GDP and an additional 1,600 jobs. Beyond the direct impacts, additional investment in telecommunications infrastructure would help more Canadians maximize their contributions to economic growth, particularly by enabling businesses across the country to expand, prosper, and service customers in Canada and internationally. Businesses will also be better served if the government can help ensure they compete on a level playing field rather than facing a disadvantage due to existing regulation. Mobile video is expected to account for 77% of mobile traffic in Canada by 2020, up from around 60% today. As Canadians continually turn to mobile devices to be entertained and access news media. However, if the current GST-HST legislative framework is not amended, Canadian providers of digital products and services will continue to be burdened by an up to 15% price disadvantage compared to their foreign competitors. Currently, foreign suppliers of digital products and services such as online news and entertainment services, music, movies, and software are not required to collect or remit HST, while similar Canadian firms are. The competitive advantage given to foreign suppliers by this policy undermines Canadian investment and innovation by encouraging Canadians to spend money outside of Canada, to the detriment of all who benefit from a strong digital economy. Canadians' growing preference for digital-based products and services makes closing this loophole more important than ever. Indeed, as consumer preferences increasingly shift from physical goods to digital options, Canadian firms will be further disadvantaged, and the revenue loss suffered by federal and provincial governments will continue to grow. We strongly believe the government should ensure taxation parity among all suppliers of digital goods in Canada, removing the competitive advantage currently enjoyed by foreign firms. This would bring Canada's regime in line with the EU, Norway, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Consumer Health Products Canada, Mr. Harrington. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et aux membres du comité pour cette opportunité.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and committee members for the opportunity you're giving me to contribute to this consultation.
Represents the manufacturers of over-the-counter medicines and natural health products. We're a $5.6 billion industry, and we account for about $1.5 billion in exports and provide jobs to 56,000 Canadians. Canadians use over-the-counter medicines and natural health products to manage their coughs and colds, their allergies, headaches, upset stomachs, and also to manage the symptoms of chronic ailments such as the pain of arthritis. That's self-care, and it matters to Canadians and contributes to a sustainable health care system by helping them avoid unnecessary doctor visits. For example, while the vast majority of Canadians with minor ailments practice self-care, Canadian surveys have established that about 1 in 7 Canadians will visit a doctor to have those ailments treated. Doctor visits for colds, headaches, and upset stomachs alone cost the healthcare system about $1 billion annually. CHP Canada has calculated that if only 16% of those people who go to the doctor with, for one of these minor ailments, and I'm speaking now of people who have self-assessed their symptoms as being relatively minor, if those people were to practice self-care instead, you would free up about 3 million doctor visits a year, and that would be enough to provide family physicians to 500,000 Canadians who currently don't have a family doctor. I'd like to speak a moment about growth, as you referred to earlier, Mr. Chairman. Many of the over-the-counter medicines Canadians use in self-care were once prescription drugs. So when you think of pain relievers like Aleve or Advil, or if you think of allergy medicines like Reactin or Arius, or even nicotine patches, these products became available over the counter by going through a regulatory process called the RX to OTC switch. And the RX to OTC switch process is the main way that our industry grows, but it's also the main way that we increase our contribution to an efficient healthcare system. Now, in terms of budget measures, we've already submitted a detailed proposal to the committee for an end to tax policies that undermine that contribution to self-care. In short, it makes no sense that when a medicine moves from prescription status to being used in self-care, it loses its exemption under the goods and services tax and its exemption or its eligibility under the medical expense tax credit. Tax policy and health policy really need to come back into alignment on this issue. But it's also a tax fairness issue, because 24% of those Canadians who go to the doctor told us, for their minor ailments, told us that they did so in order to get a prescription medicine that would be covered by their drug plan. Now, the millions of largely lower-income working Canadians who don't have access to a good quality drug plan can't avoid those taxes that way. In your questions for the consultation, you asked about broader federal actions that could contribute to economic growth. And I'd like to underline one particular initiative that's underway right now. Health Canada has just launched the first in a series of consultations on a whole new regulatory framework for these self-care products. And we applaud the department for having framed this as an attempt to help better informed self-care. But I'd like to underline a particular opportunity that really shouldn't be missed in that context. I referred earlier to the RX to OTC switch process, and unfortunately, that process in Canada lags badly by comparison to most of our major trading partners. Canadians gain access to these switch products on average 7 to 9 years after their counterparts in the United States or in the European Union. So, for example, I made reference earlier to Aleve. That product became available in Canada almost 9 years after it was available in the U.S. There's a need to address the overlapping, inefficient, and sometimes conflicting mishmash of federal and provincial regulations governing this switch process. The way it works currently, Health Canada reviews all of the evidence submitted by a manufacturer and makes a determination to approve a switch. And this is a process that takes about a year. But after that, the manufacturer has to negotiate a variety of different provincial approval processes that reaffirm the switch and then decide additional conditions of sale. This is called drug scheduling, and it's how basically it's determined whether your product is going to be purchased from behind the counter through a pharmacist or perhaps in the front shop of a pharmacy, or even if it can be sold through any outlet like a 7-Eleven. This federal-provincial interplay can delay product launches up to 2 years in some provinces, and it leads to different outcomes in different provinces, and overall basically creates a lot of disincentives to innovative manufacturers. We believe that under the auspices of this self-care framework, there's a tremendous opportunity for Health Canada to take a leadership role and integrate the drug scheduling process with the product approval process. And to do so, you'd not only make the framework much more effective, but you'd also be doing something that's entirely consistent with currently FedProv initiatives such as the negotiations on the new health accord, discussions on affordable access to medicines, and yes, reducing barriers to internal trade. So with that, I'll stop, and I'll thank you and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. With Colleges and Institutes Canada, Ms. Amiot.
Mr. Chair, committee members, thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you on behalf of Canada's extensive network of colleges, cégep, polytechnic, and institutes that serve over 3,000 urban, rural, northern, and remote communities from coast to coast to coast, with an impact of $191 billion in 2014-2015. Our students, faculty, administrators, and immediate family represent 1 Canadian out of 8. Dans son exposé écrit, Collèges et Instituts Canada a soumis 8 recommandations.
In its written brief, Colleges and Institutes Canada makes a recommendation in support of the Government of Canada's plan to accelerate inclusive, broad-based growth and diminish economic and social disparities for all Canadians. Other recommendations have been made in other consultations, including on innovation, on basic science, international development assistance and immigration, and shortly, the official languages.
Areas that our members see as opportunities to contribute to the government's agenda. First, to stimulate economic growth, Canada must unleash the innovations potential of small and medium enterprise by supporting applied research that can strengthen local economies and communities across the country. How? Colleges and institutes occupy a distinct niche in Canada's innovations ecosystem that is complementary to discovery research. Colleges have capitalized on their strong community connections and modest federal investments in applied research to respond to the R&D needs of local and regional partners. Let me give you numbers now. En 2014-2015,
in 2014-2015, colleges and institutes have worked with more than 6,000 applied research partners. Among them, 86% were minor and small and medium-sized businesses with a view to improving products, create new products, create prototypes, or new services.
Big difference is in helping these SMEs to innovate and scale up their operations, create jobs, and often in support of the vital roles they play in the supply chains of large companies. SMEs, as you know, represent 99.7% of all Canadian firms and employ 90% of the private sector workforce, but yet account just for 27% of total R&D expenditures. So there's a lot of potentials for growth. We recommend that the government ramp up federal investment in college and institute applied research over 5 years from $75 million to $300 million per year. So far, we have received funding since 2008 at up to $5 to $10 million per year, but it is insufficient, and we have to turn down the industry now. So this increase in federal support would capitalize on the very welcome strategic investments this government has made over the past few months in college and institute innovations infrastructure. So some example of how this new funding could stimulate growth: creating more specialized research centers to work with small and medium enterprise, building on the success of the 30 technology access centers the government is currently funding, expanding the reach of college-based applied research in the fields of healthcare and social innovation. Second, to achieve...
In a minute, I know you have one more recommendation, so if you could sum it up in a minute
yes,
or so.
So second, we believe we should increase the funding for Indigenous education at the post-secondary level. This government has ensured that there was funding for K-12, but not for post-secondary. We also must strengthen skills upgrading in the Indigenous communities, so we recommend that the government build on the great success of the Northern Adult Basic Education program delivered at the 3 national colleges and that help with adult basic education. Because of time, I will go to my third one immediately. And in fact, I will just conclude instead and say that over the past few months, we've heard many voices, including those of the Finance Minister's Advisory Council on Economic Growth, highlighting the opportunities and challenges facing Canada. We believe that as Canada celebrates its 150th anniversary and many colleges and institutes celebrate their 50th anniversary, we are ready to step up to build a better, more prosperous, and more equitable Canada. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. With Ms. Demers with Clean Energy Canada. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the opportunity to appear before the committee. I'm very honored to be here today. So I'm the Federal Policy Advisor for a climate and energy think tank called Clean Energy Canada. We're a project of Simon Fraser University's Centre for Dialogue. And I'd like to make 2 main points with my time here today. First, that the federal government needs to invest in measures that speed up the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And second, that the 2017 budget needs to help implement Canada's National Climate Plan. So expert assessments in Canada and around the world tell the same story. To tackle climate change, we need clean electricity to power far more of our daily activities than it does today. Over time, we need to shift from fueling our personal vehicles with gasoline to driving electric cars. Electric pumps will draw heat from the air or the ground to keep our homes warm in winter and cool in summer. Innovative industrial processes will produce the goods and materials that we need using clean power. This transition from fossil fuels to clean electricity, sometimes called electrification, is needed here in Canada, but also around the world. As a result, the global market for renewable electricity is growing quickly. So is demand for the technologies and services that underpin this transition, from smart grids to software for charging electric cars. All of this is excellent news for Canada. Our country already has one of the cleanest electricity sectors in the world. Today, over 80% of our power comes from non-emitting sources, and that share is poised to grow. This head start means that clean power is a comparative advantage for Canada. With the right policy signals as a foundation, our country can reap the benefits of growth fueled by clean electricity. We'll see those benefits in new jobs, innovation, business development, and export opportunities while reducing our carbon pollution. So our organization worked with expert stakeholders to put together a package of recommendations to accelerate Canada's clean energy transition. Some of those recommendations will be regulatory changes, but others are budget proposals. And this is what's contained in the brief that we submitted to your committee. For example, we would like to see Budget 2017 support ongoing investment in the charging infrastructure for electric vehicles and incentives for drivers to purchase electric cars, retrofits to cut energy waste in homes and other buildings, and the creation of a national action plan for electrification, which would require funding for research and analysis. I would also like to note that the very first recommendation our expert group made was for a price on carbon across Canada that grows over time. We congratulate the federal government for taking this step earlier this fall. My second main point is that the 2017 budget needs to help implement Canada's National Climate Plan. Earlier this year, federal, provincial, and territorial governments launched an effort to negotiate a pan-Canadian plan capable of achieving Canada's 2030 climate target. First Ministers will meet in December to negotiate key policies under that plan, and they have committed to having a framework ready to implement by early 2017. Last year's budget introduced two significant future spending commitments related to climate change. The second phase of federal infrastructure funding, particularly the Green Infrastructure Fund, and the $2 billion Low Carbon Economy Fund, which is due to start in 2017. This year's budget can ensure that these funds are used effectively to help kickstart clean growth under a national climate plan. We've recommended a number of potential categories for clean energy investments, including energy storage, meaning technologies that store power so we can use it when it's needed, community energy efficiency and electrification initiatives, electricity system upgrades to make the system smarter and more efficient, and transmission investment to better connect clean energy jurisdictions to those still burning fossil fuels for power. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada, Mr. Ross, Program Manager, and Ms. Ferris, Vice President. Ms. Ferris?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Alison Ferris, and I am the Vice President of the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. I am also joined by Tim Ross, our staff person responsible for policy and government relations. We're here today to offer input on measures and actions that the federal government can undertake through Budget 2017 in order to contribute to the economic growth, prosperity, and inclusion, especially as it relates to Canada's growing housing challenges. Canada's history reflects the achievement of a population that's built a powerful economy and a generous society. When Canadians work together in a manner that harmonizes economic, social, and environmental interests, Canadians thrive. This blend of cooperation and entrepreneurship is the cooperative way. When economic, social, and environmental interests are not harmonized, as currently seen in Canada's housing system, Canadians struggle. Canada's affordable housing crisis is now so acute that it not only affects low-income households, but it also affects Canada's middle class. Canada's prosperity depends on a housing system that meets the needs of all Canadians. Millions of Canadians are looking for answers, and Budget 2017 can make the difference. Canadians desire communities that support their economic aspirations, advance their social well-being, and promote environmental sustainability. Building a housing system that better supports cooperative and entrepreneurial values can help make this happen. Indeed, the housing cooperatives are making it happen. The Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada is our strong national voice for housing cooperatives. Across Canada, there are over 2,300 housing cooperatives with a portfolio of approximately 96,750 units. Over 250,000 Canadians live in a housing cooperative. At its most basic level, a cooperative is an autonomous association of persons working together to meet their own economic, social, and cultural aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. In the case of housing cooperatives, people from all walks of life are empowered to build and own housing that meets their needs in a manner that is inclusive, affordable, and sustainable. Furthermore, through our long-standing partnership with governments, housing cooperatives have been able to go the extra mile by dedicating a significant portion of units to meeting the housing aspirations of low-income households. To build upon this platform of affordability, inclusion, and sustainability, a revitalized partnership is required with the federal government. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Tim Ross to offer details.
Thank you. We see the development of a national housing strategy as a very important step in the right direction, and we really welcome this progress. We therefore urge the Finance Committee to make sure that the housing strategy is turned into housing dollars in Budget 2017. To build a more cooperative housing system for Canadians that balances the interests of people, planet, and profit, CHF Canada proposes 3 integrated initiatives. Firstly, we need to start by protecting low-income households currently living in housing cooperatives. Our member co-ops are overwhelmingly dedicated to building inclusive, mixed-income housing communities where low-income Canadians can own housing that is affordable, adequate, and suitable to their needs. But government funding that enables co-ops to house low-income Canadians has expired and will continue to sharply decline in the coming years. Without a renewed partnership, 20,000 low-income households living in housing cooperatives will face economic eviction and housing instability. We cannot let this happen. We therefore ask the Finance Committee to recommend Budget 2017 commit to replacing expired operating subsidies with new long-term funding so that low-income households living in housing cooperatives are protected. Secondly, housing co-ops now have enormous potential to leverage their mixed income revenue base, their surplus lands, and their strong equity position in order to attract new forms of investment. This leverage allows co-ops to modernize, to become more energy efficient, and to build new homes. This requires a policy and regulatory environment that supports this work. And thanks to some recent federal measures, co-ops have been able to leverage almost $100 million in new private credit union financing in just 2 short years. We've barely scratched the surface of our sector's ability to leverage new investment, and we will continue to need a supportive policy and regulatory environment to keep going. Our third proposal is simple. After decades of development and stewardship, Canada's housing cooperatives have demonstrated their durability in providing long-term affordable housing for their members. And so we urge the Finance Committee to recommend that Budget 2017 supports building new cooperative housing. We believe that if supported, these 3 recommendations, these specific measures, will bring relief to Canadians experiencing a serious housing crunch. And Canadians are looking for answers, and the federal government has unprecedented popular support to make things happen, to act. And co-ops are ready to work with the federal government to build a housing system that works for all Canadians. Thank you very much.
Thank you both for your presentation. Canadian Council for International Cooperation, Mr. Riley King.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting the Canadian Council for International Cooperation to appear before the committee today. As some of you may know, CCIC is Canada's national coalition of civil society organizations working globally to achieve sustainable human development. Our 80-plus members represent a broad range of CSOs working in international development and humanitarian assistance, from faith-based and secular groups to labor unions and cooperatives to professional associations. Some of our members, including the Canadian Food Grains Bank and Oxfam Canada, have already appeared before this committee. Together with 8 provincial and regional councils, our collective membership is more than 400 organizations strong. But I'm here to speak on behalf of a broader range of groups. From Canada Revenue Agency data, we know that our country is home to approximately 2,400 registered charities that focus on international aid and development. Including not-for-profits, that number is almost double. In total, in 2011, charities working in this sector reported $3.9 billion in revenue and $3.6 billion in direct expenditures. These charities receive $1.2 billion in tax-receipted gifts and $600 million from the federal government. They employ over 14,000 full-time staff and 32,000 temporary staff. But what of our work? The global context has changed substantially even in the last decade. With globalization, issues that affect other countries almost always spill over into our own backyard, affecting both Canadian society and the Canadian economy. At home, Canadians have felt the impact of health pandemics like SARS, the avian flu, and Ebola. We've welcomed tens of thousands of refugees into our country as a result of the civil war in Syria. A financial crisis that erupted on Wall Street and in Europe shook the foundations of the Canadian economy. The impacts, both social and economic, of these and other challenges, like humanitarian crises, climate change, or inequality, are well documented and are being profoundly felt both at home and in particular in developing countries. It's in the immediate interest of Canada and Canadians, and indeed of the planet, for the government to make significant investments in tackling these global challenges. It should be patently clear that building a fairer, more sustainable, and safer world is in everyone's interests, and we believe this government and this country has the opportunity to be a leader in realizing that vision. In the next few months, Global Affairs Canada will release a new policy statement outlining the government's approach to international assistance. But this cannot just be a plan for Global Affairs Canada. It must be a plan for all of Canada. It must lay the foundations for a coherent whole-of-government strategy that engages a host of government departments, as well as civil society and the private sector, on issues of diplomacy, development and trade, yes, but also on migration, economy, environment, and peace and security, among other things. It should be accompanied by a whole-of-government support in Budget 2017 for a 5-year international assistance funding framework. Budget 2017 should include a timetable of predictable annual increases to the international assistance envelope, or aid budget. This timetable should put us on a fiscal escalator to at least double the aid budget. And it should be framed within the UN and Canadian-designed target of reaching 0.7% of gross national income. Right now, Canada sits at about 0.26%, up from 0.24 2 years ago. And these figures matter to Canada and how it's perceived internationally by its peers. Without substantial increases to our aid envelope in the coming years, this government risks having the worst record in Canadian history in terms of investments in international assistance. The chart and table, which I've circulated, identify 3 possible scenarios for these increases, as well as the timeline to reach various milestones depending on which scenario is selected. That's on the back. Canada can have greater impact with this increased investment through greater country or thematic focus, as it has done in the past, or through increased and targeted investments that reflect the government's ambitions. For example, in women's rights and gender equality, or investing in the poorest and most marginalized and fragile states. Canada and the Canadian economy prospers when the world prospers. In conclusion, in Budget 2017, we hope to see substantial new investments in Canada's international assistance envelope. This would allow Canada to make a more significant contribution to solving social, economic, and environmental global challenges through its international assistance. We believe it's time for Canada to reassert its leadership on the global stage. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your brief and your presentation. Turning then to RENA, Mr. Keeshan. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. No home, no job equals negative economic impact. Mr. Chairman, committee members, thank you for including me today. My name is Brian Keshen. I'm the President and CEO of a small social service agency serving children, adults, and seniors with developmental disabilities. As the CEO of a small nonprofit, I recognize how budgets send a message. And from my perspective, you have a chance to send a message about the inclusion of people with developmental disabilities into our society in the next budget. In response to your question, what federal measures would help Canadians with a disability maximize their contribution? I can think of nothing better than housing. To invest in housing, it creates a gateway to personal independence while reducing costs, increasing engagement, productivity, and creating healthy communities. With your support, the federal budget can send a leadership message that is inclusive and proactive in support of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities by committing and dedicating 5% of any funds flowing through the National Housing Strategy to housing for people with developmental disabilities, making a requirement for provincial housing programs. This, in combination with the Canadians with Disabilities Act and the expanding employment efforts for disabled Canadians, would transform the lives and quality of contribution of those with developmental disabilities to Canada's economic growth. I speak today not only on behalf of our agency, but the 37 other agencies in the Toronto area serving and providing over $1 billion worth of housing assets, managing $1 billion worth of housing assets. Our budget alone is $40 million in annual operations, managing $80 million in property. We serve over 1,000 people. We also support 150 people in affordable public and private rental units. We know housing. We know housing matters. We know that across this country, those with intellectual disabilities are amongst those most at risk. With extraordinary high rates of homelessness, often living in inappropriate settings such as shelters, hospitals, long-term care, and prisons, costing governments 2 to 3 times the cost of independent living. 90% of adults with developmental disabilities live below the poverty line. 70% have experienced abuse. Amongst the women who are developmentally disabled, it's higher. This is a vulnerable population where we know supportive housing, safe housing, can make a difference and improve the quality of lives. My message that it's imperative that those with developmental disabilities have a choice to be included in the community rather than languishing in hospitals, shelters, or being locked in basements. The cost to our healthcare system, our municipal social supports to provide inadequate and inappropriate care is driven by the absence of housing. RENA in September 2012 in the riding of King Vaughan opened one model solution that provides apartments for 84 adults with developmental, cognitive, physical, or mental health needs. The residence is designed as an intentional community for individuals with special needs. The residents receive federal, provincial funding and raised the majority through philanthropic giving. The residence provides a home for people who otherwise would not have a home. Recently, the Ontario Ombudsman's report on developmental services highlighted the issue, and the Minister, Mr. Helena Jasic, recognized the community residence as one model that works at solving the issues for people who are in critical need. I invite you to go into your communities, go into your hospitals, speak to your care providers, ask those who are vulnerable in your community what they need, and housing will come up front and center. We did, and we met a young man named Mark. Mark had been living 15 years in a hospital. We were able to provide a home in the community. To him, it's given him a life. And I invite you to meet Mark. Anyone who wants to come see our center, please meet Mark. But Mark is in every community across this country. People are looking to have a life. The message is the same. People with developmental disabilities are not a priority right now. They're not seen or heard from. You need to send a different message. We are underway with a consortium of 8 organizations to develop similar models across Ontario. We invite you to participate, we invite you to take a leadership role, and we invite you to be engaged in helping those most vulnerable. It does not require any new investment. It requires taking a planned investment and directing it to those who are vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Keshen. National Angel Capital Organization, Mr. Navarro.
Thank you very much, Chairperson Easter, and to the committee members for inviting us to present today. I think of all the organizations here, we're probably one of the ones that's least used to these opportunities, so we appreciate the opportunity. We're here today because we wanted to bring an opportunity to the government that we see to actually make a small investment in trying to solve what is a critical problem by leveraging the private sector to support economic development through innovation. And we think that this small investment will have a huge impact in creating the infrastructure really that will allow private sector investors to deploy more capital to support the development of new technologies and new companies that will really become the future employers for our country. And so with that, because I don't know all of you, I haven't had the chance to meet all of you, I wanted to maybe give a bit of background on who we are and what we represent. NACO is since 2002 actually, is the National Industry Association for the Angel Investor Community in Canada. We represent today a community of 41 networks, 3,000 investors across the country, that having started from 100 investors that came together many years ago just simply to talk each other into making some investments and help each other avoid mistakes. And really, our community today spans across the country, everywhere from Victoria to St. John's, to Yukon, to Winnipeg. We're in every community, really, and that's really what makes Angels unique. Our mission and our organization's mission is to grow and develop the Canadian investor community and evolve it into an asset class of investment that can be there to drive economic development. Our vision really is for a broad-based community that exists in every community where there are entrepreneurs, and I can guarantee you that in each of your writings, you've each met with young, promising entrepreneurs with ideas that are looking for capital and are having difficulty finding that capital. And so really what we do is really 3 things for our community. We bring together the angel investor community by identifying them, by recruiting them to join our nation building initiative. We connect them together to help each other share ideas, share best practices, share deal flow, collaborate, pool capital together, and fund those companies. We also help them improve outcomes through research, through education, through best practices, by that same collaboration. And finally, we act as a voice for that community by telling their stories, by telling the stories of the investors, of the entrepreneurs, and through that trying to drive the kind of cultural change that we need in Canada in order to generate the culture of entrepreneurship and risk-taking that's going to be necessary to compete in the long term at the global stage. And so, what are angel investors? And for those of you who don't know, and I know that some of you have already spoken to about this, but angel investors are really high net worth individuals, and this is defined in regulation, who are usually entrepreneurs and professionals. They have large social networks. They usually are locally focused, so usually it's about giving back to their community and to people and entrepreneurs in their community. But they enjoy investing in early stage, high risk entrepreneurs, in people essentially, people that most other people wouldn't invest in, which certainly financial institutions wouldn't invest in because the economics are just much too risky, but they do it because they know that they're giving back. The problem with angel investors is that they often invest alone. They often lack self-awareness about the fact that they are angel investors or how they invest, what leads them to invest. And through that, they make mistakes. And unfortunately, they don't invest in themselves and in their processes. They only invest in companies and entrepreneurs. And so what that means is that it's quite difficult for entrepreneurs to find them. It's quite difficult for entrepreneurs to pool larger rounds of capital and to get to the point where a VC or institutional investor will actually take a look at them. And so what that does is it creates a gap. And we call this the funding innovation continuum gap. Really, it starts somewhere around the point where incubators and accelerators can no longer support these companies and lasts until about the VCs would come in, which usually is about the $5 million investment mark. So anywhere between $50,000 and $5 million, there's a massive gap that everybody is always relying on private individuals to fund. And what we do is connect that community together to help them overcome the valley of death. And that valley of death can take 3 to 15 years depending on the company and the industry. It's a critical component of funding the innovation continuum. What angel investors do is they invest their own capital, and we break this down to 3 types of capital: financial capital, intellectual capital, and network capital. In other words, their money, their networks, and their experience. And they bring that to bear for the entrepreneurs to help them support building their companies and growing those companies and scaling them. The important thing to understand here is that angel investors are literally everywhere, but we need to help them identify and we need to help them be more coordinated. Without that, the entrepreneurs are forced to move to urban centers often. You hear a lot about entrepreneurs having to move to one of the 4 or 5 key urban centers. That's not really necessary if they can find the investors locally, and if those investors locally can help them find more capital outside of that local market.
Yuri, we'll have if you can go to the recommendation.
Yeah, okay, so the recommendation here is that we want to support the national expansion of these angel networks and the national collaboration of these angel networks. Up until now, we've really been supported at the community level through regional and local programming, but what that has done is create disparate kind of growth. So we have growth in certain urban communities, but not in rural communities, not in certain underdeveloped communities, indigenous communities, minorities, etc. And what we want to make sure is that we're looking at it from a national approach in terms of growing this critical component. The second thing that we wanted to recommend is actually that the government continue to fund some of the programs through organizations like FedDev, Western Diversification, FedNor, ACOA at a local level in order to continue to build the local networks, but that they also look at coordinating data and research at a central level in order to make sure that we have the insights that we need in order to support the development of this community.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. It would. We have a stop at 6:30 unless we have unanimous consent. If we're going to get 5 questions in total at 5 minutes, we need to go a few minutes beyond 6:30. Do we have unanimous consent to do that? It won't be any more than about 6:40. Okay, we do. Then starting with Ms. O'Connell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for your presentations. I want to start with the presentation from Rena, Mr. Keshin, if I'm saying that correctly. Thank you for your presentation. This is an issue very near and dear to my heart. I'm not sure if you're familiar with DAFRS from Durham Region, but that was an organization I, until recently, was vice chair of. So the issue of housing, in particular for persons with disabilities and cognitive disabilities, is something I know fairly well. One of the points that you made in terms of the strain or the burden by not having proper housing for people with disabilities is you mentioned hospitals, but we found as well that young people with disabilities are going into nursing homes because their families can't handle it and there's really just not adequate, which I think is an absolutely horrible situation. But I want to make sure I understand your presentation clearly in terms of the 5% of funds for housing. You mentioned the model that your organization just offered in terms of the 80 units, I believe you said. But that's not the only model you're suggesting. You just want housing availability specific for persons with disabilities, because I understand some people, their needs might be greater than others. Some can live in a fully integrated system just with support services. So it's not the model you're advocating for, just as long as there's direct, dedicated funding. Am I understanding that correctly?
You're correct. It is a model, not the model, and the opportunities, expanding opportunities for independent living is crucial for everyone.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association. I found your brief particularly of interest. You know, we know that Canadian telecommunications companies have some of the highest profits in the world. The rates to consumers were the highest in an 8-country study. Your brief mentioned your industry has invested $55 billion, but here's the number I find most interesting. Since 1987, that's just a few years younger than me. Have you actually invested enough in infrastructure to support your own industry, especially considering your high profits and extremely high consumer rates?
I would say most definitely. If you look at what I discussed in my presentation, and the same stats are in our submission, where the Canadian network is relative to Europe, in particular its size. As I said, our network, so just the areas that are covered, is bigger than the UK, France, Spain, Germany, and Italy combined. And that's the entire landmass of those countries, not just their network footprint. So right away that size. And then you look at Canadians being the 4th highest users in the world. So behind only Japan, Korea, and Sweden, and Canadians having access to among the fastest network speeds in the world. So certainly, yes, and that investment must continue to continue to meet that demand. The CRTC released information yesterday that said in the most recent year they studied, wireless data use increased by 44% just in 1 year.
Perhaps you should come to my community of Pickering-Uxbridge, because I can assure you we don't have very fast rates or very fast internet speeds, and we're just outside of Toronto. I have a rural component, but forget the rural component for a second. In my urban, suburban municipality directly on the border of Toronto, we can't get more internet because because you asked for spectrum, and I find this particularly interesting. Part of our problem in getting internet to my community in particular is because the spectrum is combined with places like Toronto. So for the big telecommunication companies, they don't need to invest in Pickering-Uxbridge or some of the other communities because all their consumers are in Toronto. And yet they then don't allow any of that higher spectrum to be sold to community or to companies that can actually deliver to rural or suburban areas. So do you feel that if the government were to release spectrum, that if you...
Ms. O'Connell, if you could speed up, there's not much time left. Might you provide an answer, please?
That if you don't use the spectrum, then you lose it, and it has to go back onto the market.
Right, there is a use it or lose it clause already in most spectrum licenses, and we support that.
More competition in the market would help. Thank you.
Merci. Alors, Monsieur Albus, pour 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mariach. 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank all of our witnesses today. Appreciate you bringing ideas. We unfortunately don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to just make my questions and comments as brief as I can. I'm going to start with the Clean Energy Canada. Thank you, Mr. Demers. Your brief here, there's a couple things I agree with, a couple of things I profoundly disagree with. But hopefully we can have a good discussion about some of these things. First of all, I do agree that there is an opportunity for innovation on electrification, particularly with some of the older pieces of legislation. One thing I would just ask you is you talk about in your brief interprovincial and regional cooperation. Most of our population, as you know, is close to the United States border. So when you say regional cooperation, does that include the Americans, or is that just within Canada?
So we think it makes a lot of sense to also exchange electricity across international borders. So for example, when we had the Three Amigos Summit here in Ottawa, there was a North American clean energy target signed between the three countries. And Canada is the furthest ahead in this continent in terms of the percentage of our grid that is clean. So we offer a resource obviously predominantly to the United States rather than to Mexico, where we could be having
And
this type of exchange.
And I'm happy to hear you say, obviously from British Columbia, we have a lot of hydro electricity, a lot of capacity. We'd love to share it with Alberta. We'd love to be able to share it with whoever would like it. Now, obviously, there's some issues. We've been burned before by sending electricity to California. But ultimately, I do agree with the concept of it. The one thing, though, you say in your brief here, when it talks about the utilities legislation, for example, we have the BCUC, and its actual slogan, I guess its reason d'etre is low, low cost electricity for generations. And the one thing I do see is that you're asking for things to be changed so that there is a preference towards clean energy production. I totally disagree with that in the sense that if you look at what's happened in Ontario, those kinds of market distortion activities have really created a situation where there's a lot of hardship on a lot of seniors. Would you agree that there's been a fair bit of upset within this province about how the Clean Energy Act or Green Energy Act has translated?
I think Ontario's feed-in tariff program I think provides a really important model, and what we saw was a really good effort to obviously invest in clean energy. You know, we have some leading companies that have been nurtured by Ontario's approach. There are obviously also elements where it could have been managed better.
On the flip side, in British Columbia, the BCUC has to, because we're at the end of WAC Bennett's legacy, where a lot of hydropower projects were made, where it's 60 years. A lot of that has to be renewed, and in fact, we have to expand. And so, what people are being hit, seniors are being hit with when I door knock, 8% per year. And to me, the best model would be is to allow just a point, over a longer period of time, 1% every year, and that doesn't allow for that. So I really do appreciate, you making the suggestion that should be there, and I do think that needs to happen. But this being a provincial power, under provincial regulation, I think will be very tough. But I do appreciate your suggestions, and like I said, I do agree with some of it. I'd like to just quickly go to the Canadian Health Products Association. I'm sorry, Jerry. Interprovincial trade has been an intense passion of mine. I've heard that there is, in British Columbia, it can be up to 7 years after Health Canada has made a switch, allowing for something to be, they say it's safe for self-care. Is this an area that should receive more attention?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, and in fact, actually, relative to the Health Canada decision, it's about 2 years, but the impact of that delay leads to delays of up to 7 to 9 years nationally, simply because manufacturers have no incentive to initiate the switch in Canada because of the inability to do a national launch. But the impact I would want to underline on that is also the impact on employment. So while you have that delay, which is a period over which time provinces continue to pay for unnecessary doctor visits, the other thing that it does is ours is a global industry. And so when a product is being considered for switch and to be made into a consumer health product, that company basically has an internal competition for who will get the mandate to manufacture and export it across the globe. And you're not going to be at the table in that competition if you're not even bringing the product to market in a timely way. So what we see is that our share of the manufacturing in that growth area is very much adversely affected. There are jobs that can be found this way.
Yeah, that's it. You're over. Mr. Caron.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'll continue along the same line of questions as Ms. Carroll. We've already had meetings. Are you getting the interpretation? Is it coming through? So we had meetings in the past regularly. And the reason is that if the service in Ms. O'Connell's riding is slow and not appropriate, in the case of my riding, we don't have high speed other than with satellite service, which isn't very reliable. I have 8 communities out of the 19 of Temiscouata that still don't have any cell coverage. We talked about various possibilities. People ask me this: why is it that we had access, everyone, to ground lines. Perhaps in remote areas, people shared a line, but everyone did have a ground line. And I'm answering, well, back then, Bell had a monopoly, and it was part of the monopoly conditions on the market. The service was more expensive for everyone throughout the country, but at least everyone had the service. Once the monopoly was abolished and the market was opened up, fine. The markets were opened up to allow for long distance, cell phones and high tech, etc. On the other hand, although the prices dropped because of the entry of new players, well, we're now stuck in a situation where we have people who are in third world conditions with regard to telecommunications because there isn't enough density to provide income to the companies that could go there. Yes, we have a free market. Yes, TELUS, Bell, Rogers could go in those remote communities to provide service, but they don't do so. In your presentation, and I'm not upset with you, it's the situation that frustrates me, and we've seen it over and over again in the past 5 years. I want to understand how we could ensure that all rural communities in this country might be served. The 8 communities in Témiscouata that don't have cell coverage, how might they eventually obtain this? If the free market isn't working for those individuals, those people, I see that as the carrot. So we'll have to come out with a stick at some point, and we'll have to find a way of forcing them to offer 21st century service, which is necessary today. During the CRTC hearings last spring, I appeared before them. My appearance lasted a good 45 minutes. And you won't agree with the suggestion or solution I put forward, but it was that if all of the big tel players founded an independent consortium in which they would provide both funding and non-used frequencies, to leave the decision up to that consortium to invest in rural communities that are underserviced or not serviced at all, well, that was my idea. All of that being said, I'd like your perspective on the coverage of rural areas for the big players and even the small firms that are part of your association.
Suggested accelerated capital cost allowance. That's going to cover more areas. I've been clear. It's not going to solve the issue, and
would like to know, I have a guarantee that this won't be used to actually continue I won't say over-serving, but going to the urban centers where the money is.
Well,
that's my fear.
Right, I understand that for sure. It would be for all investment, though, and it would definitely go in urban and rural. But I think I've been clear in the past. There will be a little bit more, I think, necessary. The CRTC was clear. I don't want to prejudge what they're going to say in that ruling, but they spoke about possible government involvement in terms of funding. The government's already funding fixed broadband, and so whether they would move into wireless. As I said, there's about $1 billion on every budget coming just from payments for the rights to use spectrum. So, we think there's some money there.
Et ça, c'est mon message au gouvernement, en fait, c'est le fait que depuis...
And that's my message to the government. In fact, since the 90s, the funding always goes to broadband. There's never been a single significant program from the federal government to cover cell service. So it's a message I'm putting out there. It's not your decision. It'll be up to the government. There's going to be an economic update and a 2017 budget. And I think this message must be out there, and I hope I have the support of the major players.
Mr. Sabera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, guests. Presenter, excuse me. I wanted to start off with the Cooperative Housing Federation. In your recommendations, number 2, on leveraging private investment for the renovation and modernization of housing co-ops, can you provide some more color to that? I was interested in that recommendation, please.
Thank you for the question. To put this into a little bit more detail, we are looking for a supportive regulatory environment that enables housing cooperatives to leverage their asset. There have been some particular barriers to that in the form of the long-term operating agreements that many housing cooperatives have with the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation. The operating agreements are often quite administratively burdensome, and they pose a barrier to refinancing the asset. So many housing co-ops have their first mortgage with CMHC, and as a part of through the amortization of that mortgage and as a part of the operating agreement with CMHC, there are restrictions on how they can leverage their asset. Recent policy changes have allowed some housing cooperatives to prepay their first CMHC mortgage, so taking it off the government's books, but then also negotiating a reasonable interest penalty. Until recently, the interest penalties were quite astronomically high, and it didn't make sense for housing cooperatives to refinance. And the additional cost of not being able to refinance and get out of that first long-term high-interest mortgage with CMHC would mean that co-ops could not access the capital that they need to keep their asset in a good state of repair. So therefore, critical repairs and modernizations are further deferred, endangering the useful life of the asset.
Mr. Chair, are we going to have enough time for one more round from our side of questions? Okay, I'd like to split my time with Mr. Grewal.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I don't think that we mean to pick on you, Kurt, but my questions are for you as well. I was just complaining about my wireless bill to my wireless provider just today, and then so I started doing my own research, and because people complain on a general basis that we pay some of the highest rates, and I don't think I use my phone more than the average Canadian, but maybe I do. But then I started to look at statistics. So we got, for fixed broadband internet prices, we are the third most expensive. For fixed broadband internet prices over a certain speed, we are the fourth most expensive. For fixed broadband prices at 100 Mbps, we're the second most expensive. Then we go on to wireless. So mobile wireless prices for 150 incoming and outgoing minutes, the most expensive country in the world. For 1,200 incoming and outgoing minutes, we are the second most expensive country in the world. And well, we could keep going, but you think what I'm trying to get at is that we're very expensive when it comes to wireless and wireless providers. The Bell, and I used to be a co-op student there, and I'm a Rogers customer, so I'm even keel across the board. They always go against opening up the market, right? So now, what would you think the impact for consumers would be if we let Verizon into the market in Canada?
I think there was a study by the Competition Bureau that was filed with the CRTC a couple of years ago, where they said if there was a fourth fully funded national provider that retail rates would go down by 2%, I think, and so that's from the Competition Bureau. That was their study. That's what I could tell you.
I mean, practically speaking, I mean, as a former Bay Street lawyer and a financial analyst for Fortune 500, that doesn't seem legitimate. I mean, you're a smart guy. I mean, if we were to open up the country's wireless content, you think that the competition would only spew a 2% decrease in wireless bills?
I didn't. That is from the Competition Bureau.
But you're representing the industry. You forget the Competition Bureau. What do you think?
What do I think? No. It is open.
It's open.
I mean, Verizon could come in and buy Eastlink, Videotron, SaskTel, MTS all at once and grow as big as it wants under the current rules. So it is open. I think they were, heavily courted by a previous government to come, and they looked at the opportunity to invest and make a return here, and it's a very capital-intensive business. Most of these companies made no money for the first 7, 8, 9 years they were in business. So looking at that and deciding what to build.
But then they make a lot of money.
Right.
I mean,
so I would
like an extreme amount of money. I mean, it's the best business to be in my humble opinion.
Sure. And if we're going to talk about Verizon specifically, I would point to the fact that...
And Raj, I bet you they can afford some corporate lawyers.
I'm sure they can. I'm not a corporate lawyer anymore, so...
I mean, Verizon is the most expensive wireless provider in the world. Their rates are higher than any Canadian company. And they have more than 100 million subscribers in the U.S.
We're going to cut you there,
last point, Mr. Chair.
Okay, quick.
And I wouldn't interrupt his authority. There's truck drivers in my neck of the woods who have American cell phone numbers because the North American plan is cheaper. Yeah. Think about that for a second. They're okay with having a U.S. cell phone number because that plan in the United States is cheaper than what we provide here. And it all has to do with the big guys, the Bells and Rogers of the world, protecting their interests here. Although the Rogers invested in the Blue Jays, so I would pass that on to your client as well.
I
If
don't
they
think-
re-sign those two players, I'll back off next
I
week.
don't think, Kurt, you need to answer that. That's turning to Mr. Deltel and Bouteilleff jointly. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Messieurs, Mesdames, soyez les bienvenus.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. All of this was very interesting, especially what my colleague just said. I understand he's dressed in blue today, but all of this was really very interesting. I would like to pursue the conversation with you, Mr. Eby. Why is it precisely that in the Canadian market there are such high distortions and differences between the Canadian and American markets? We understand that Canada doesn't have the same demographics. There's a geographical reality as well at play. But several Canadians, many Canadians, are wondering how we might free things up more. Open question for you. How might we free up present regulations in order to allow a price drop?
And made some changes too, and prices did decline. I would say that when data usage is increasing by 40, 50% per year, I can't really think of a lot of industries where what people are using increases that amount, and to think that prices would somehow go down significantly.
The floor is to Mr. Abouteilleff.
Well, I have a question to the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada. I mean, something that you mentioned, you need to leverage the asset, which is a public asset, maybe semi-public, if you wish to say, in order to be able to maintain the units and the lifelong of the units that you own. Isn't it a normal practice in your business to save money on the side, to keep some money on the side in order to do that? And how can you expect the government to give you a policy to leverage borrowing money on the government account?
Thank you for your question. First, just in terms of the cooperative identity, housing cooperatives are autonomous, non-governmental organizations who do have long-term operating agreements and partnerships with government, but they are autonomous and they are outside of government, just in terms of the cooperative identity. Secondly, in terms of a normal business practice of setting aside replacement reserves or capital reserves, that is a practice within housing cooperatives across the country. However, there are actually a few anomalies in the way replacement reserves are saved, and that is a result of the strict operating agreements, long-term operating agreements with CMHC that have actually in some cases prevented housing cooperatives from allocating a sufficient amount to their replacement reserves, which has contributed to a capital repair backlog in some cases. So that's why it's even more important today that these autonomous cooperative enterprises that are home to Canadians, they can go out onto the market, get better interest rates in order to modernize their properties, make them more energy efficient, and preserve a very good quality housing stock for Canadians.
Do I have one more minute? Okay, a quick question to the College and Institute Canada. You're asking for a four-fold increase from $775 million to $300 million annually for the next 5 years. That's a very significant increase you're asking for. Do you have the infrastructure and the detailed plan in order to be able to cope with these increases and to make it a logical case so the government can be convinced to invest with you?
Absolutely. We do have most of our colleges involved now in applied research. And for example, we have 30 technology access centers across the country. And in Quebec alone, they have close to 50 what they call CCTT. So they are College Center for Transfer of Technology. But over and beyond that, I'll just give you some stats with respect to the infrastructure. There are, where is it? 763 specialized research centers and labs across the country. So yes, we do have the infrastructure, but it's always nice to have more infrastructure. And the government has been quite good recently in putting $2 billion with respect to post-secondary infrastructure. And a number of our colleges, in fact, across the country, receive funding to build new centers or new research centers, whether linked to entrepreneurship or linked to energy or linked to any other areas that you can imagine with respect to applied research. On top of it is that there is already provisions by the Canadian CFI, Canadian Foundations for Innovations, which provide funding on a yearly basis for colleges and institutes that would have needs. Why do we need funding right now? I'll give you just some examples. First is to increase the number of technology access centers, which are really centers of excellence in applied research targeted to specific areas. Second, it would be to increase the funding that we currently have under NSERC to help small and medium enterprise, is to make permanent the Social Innovations Fund that we got under the previous government, but which funding has finished, and it was temporary, so we would like to have it permanent and to have more funding, because as I said earlier, currently we have to say no to the industry because they knock on the door and they say, can you help us to develop this new product? We have this idea, and very often we have to turn them down now because there's just not enough capacity.
We're going to have to.
I'll stop here.
We're going to have to end it there, Denise. We're at a time, and I'm sorry not everyone got a question in the questioning round, but this. I want to thank each of the witnesses for their briefs and their presentations and their answering questions. This does wrap up our hearings on pre-budget consultations. There's a lot of work to do. Some of you folks have a lot of work to do, as well as us. And members need to be thinking about what kind of recommendations they want to put forward in the report when it is prepared. So seeing as this is the last meeting at this stage, I do want to thank all witnesses we've heard since, I guess, the last week of September, and certainly to thank the Library of Parliament staff for all the work that they did, the logistics officers, the clerks, the analysts, translators. So there's a lot of people to thank. This process doesn't come easy. So we thank everyone for all their help in making this process work. So with that, we shall adjourn, and thanks all.